The air in the great North Sea port of Wilhelmshaven on this late October night of 1918 was thick with the biting chill of the coming winter. A cold that seemed to seep not just into the bones of the men, but into the very soul of the German Empire itself. A low fog, the kind that muffles sound and distorts light, clung to the harbor, a fitting shroud for a nation on the brink of collapse. On the decks of the vast warships, their gray metal hulls looming like ghosts in the mist, restless figures moved in the shadows. The familiar, regimented sounds of naval life, the clank of a metal boot, the quiet creak of a rope, the distant whistle of a watch, were swallowed by an unusual silence, a tense, expectant quiet that hung over everything. These sailors, the backbone of the Kaiser's mighty imperial navy, were not preparing for battle, but for a protest. They were tired of war, tired of hunger, and tired of being treated as disposable pawns by men in grand uniforms who still sat in warm rooms far away. A whispered rumor, a glance from one deck to another, was all it took. The orders had come down for one last glorious naval battle, a final, suicidal charge against the British fleet. It was to be a last gasp of imperial pride, a desperate roll of the dice in a game already lost. But as the order was passed down, a collective shudder ran through the ships. The men knew it was not a strategic maneuver, but a pointless sacrifice designed to save the honor of a crumbling regime. They looked at each other, their faces illuminated briefly by the glow of a cigarette, and in that moment, a shared understanding passed between them. They would not sail. The German Revolution of 1918, a seismic shift that would topple an empire and birth a fragile republic, did not begin in the elegant halls of Berlin, but on the cold, fog-swept decks of these warships, with the quiet defiance of ordinary sailors. Did you know that this was the very moment the great wheel of history, so long stuck in the mud of the Great War, began to turn with a groan? It began with a whisper and a refusal to die for a cause already dead. The stage had been set for this moment for years. The long, brutal grind of the First World War had pushed Germany to its absolute breaking point. At home, the civilians faced crippling shortages. Food was rationed, then re-rationed, until there was barely enough to survive. The infamous turnip winter of 1916-1917 was a time of true desperation, where people were forced to subsist on little more than root vegetables. The factories, once a source of immense pride, were now churning out instruments of death, their furnaces fueled by the labor and lifeblood of the German working class. As the war dragged on, the initial patriotic fervor of 1914 had long since curdled into a bitter resentment. People were hungry, tired, and increasingly furious at the ruling elite, who seemed so detached from their suffering. The Kaiser and his generals, in their grand headquarters, appeared to be living in a different world, obsessed with an unattainable victory while the nation starved. This widespread discontent created a fertile ground for radical ideas. Socialist and communist movements, once fringe elements, began to find a growing audience. The Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, USPD, and the even more radical Spartacist League, led by the charismatic and brilliant Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, began to advocate for fundamental change, not just an end to the war, but an end to the entire imperial system. The German High Command, led by the powerful duo of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, had effectively become the true rulers of the country. They were a military dictatorship in all but name, bypassing the Reichstag and even the Kaiser himself to make critical decisions. But by the autumn of 1918, they knew the war was lost. Ludendorff, in a moment of panic and with little regard for the civilian government, demanded that a new, more democratic government be formed to negotiate an armistice. He wanted to shift the blame for the inevitable surrender away from the military and onto the civilian politicians. This cynical move set the stage for a constitutional reform where the old autocratic system was replaced with a parliamentary monarchy, putting Prince Max von Baden in charge as chancellor. But this attempt at a controlled top-down revolution was far too little, far too late. The dam had already broken. The resentment had boiled over, and the people were no longer content with a few concessions from their rulers. They wanted a complete overhaul. Back in Wilhelmshaven, the sailors refused to follow orders. This was not a pre-planned political act, but a spontaneous, collective rejection of a pointless death. They sabotaged their ships, extinguishing fires in the boilers, and when the officers tried to force them, they simply mutinied. Word of their rebellion spread like wildfire. By November 3rd, the mutiny had reached the port of Kiel. Thousands of sailors and dock workers, joined by soldiers and civilians, marched through the streets, raising red flags and demanding the release of their comrades. The local governor was powerless. The revolution, which had been smoldering beneath the surface for months, had now burst into flame. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a little thing, but it helps a great deal. The Kiel Mutiny was the spark that ignited the entire German Empire. A central historical fact of this period is that the Kiel Uprising was not started by a political party, but by the soldiers and sailors themselves, who were then joined by the civilian population. This gave the revolution an organic, ground-up momentum that no amount of political maneuvering could stop. The speed with which it spread was astonishing. News traveled by train and telegraph, and within days, cities across Germany, Hamburg, Bremen, Cologne, and many others, saw the formation of workers' and soldiers' councils. These councils, modeled loosely on the Russian Soviets, took over local administration, arrested their officers, and called for an end to the monarchy. The old order was dissolving with a speed that shocked everyone, from the generals to the revolutionaries themselves. The Kaiser's authority, which had seemed so permanent, so unshakable, vanished into the fog of history. He had lost control not to a rival army, but to his own people. The wave of revolutionary fervor that began on the cold decks of the Imperial Navy ships now swept across the German landscape with astonishing speed. The first whisper of defiance in Kiel had quickly become a roar that resonated in every major city. Workers and soldiers, galvanized by the sailors' mutiny, began forming councils in a process that felt less like a coordinated political movement and more like a spontaneous, communal awakening. These councils, which were springing up in Hamburg, Cologne, Leipzig, and countless other urban centers, were not just a symbolic gesture of solidarity. They were a practical, immediate seizure of power. The old administrative structures, The city councils, the military garrisons, the police forces seemed to simply dissolve as the revolutionary councils took their place, often without a single shot being fired. The local police would sometimes stand aside, or in many cases, actively join the swelling ranks of the revolutionaries. It was as if the authority of the Kaiser and his representatives had been nothing more than a shared illusion, and as soon as people collectively decided it was no longer real, it simply vanished. The sight of soldiers ripping the insignia from their uniforms and embracing civilians was a common one, a powerful visual testament to the sudden and complete erosion of the old order. On November 7th, the revolution reached the heart of Bavaria. In Munich, the charismatic and radical socialist Kurt Eisner declared Bavaria a free state and a republic, effectively deposing the Wittelsbach monarchy that had ruled the region for centuries. The King of Bavaria, Ludwig III, saw the writing on the wall and fled, making him the first of Germany's many princely rulers to be swept away by the revolutionary tide. This Bavarian declaration was a massive psychological blow to the old regime. If the Kaiser could no longer even hold on to his most powerful federal state, what hope was there for the rest of his empire? The revolution was no longer just a naval mutiny or a series of scattered protests. It was a nationwide cascade of regime change. The speed was dizzying, almost disorienting for the people living through it. They had gone to bed under an empire and woke up in a world of councils, red flags, and the promise of a new, unknown future. Back in Berlin, the capital's streets were thick with tension. Rumors swirled like autumn leaves in a gale. The Social Democrats, SPD, led by the pragmatic Friedrich Ebert and Philipp Scheidemann, knew they had to act. They were caught in a precarious position. On one hand, they had long advocated for a democratic republic and welcomed the end of the monarchy. On the other hand, they were terrified of a radical, Soviet-style revolution like the one that had consumed Russia a year earlier. They wanted to steer the revolution toward a stable parliamentary democracy, not a chaotic, class-based upheaval. They wanted a revolution from above, not from below. But the more radical socialists, particularly the Spartacist League, saw this moment as their opportunity to create a truly socialist state, to nationalize industry and establish power in the hands of the workers' and soldiers' councils. The man in the center of this storm was Kaiser Wilhelm II himself. He was at his military headquarters in Spa, Belgium, far from the chaos of Berlin. He believed, almost delusionally, that he still had the loyalty of his army. The generals, however, knew better. They knew that their troops, many of whom were veterans of the front, were tired of fighting and had no desire to die protecting a Kaiser who had in their eyes abandoned them. General Wilhelm Groener, the successor to Ludendorff, was the one who delivered the bitter truth to the Kaiser. The army would not march on Berlin to suppress the revolution. The Kaiser had lost their support. Faced with this blunt reality, and with the revolution now at the gates of Berlin, the Kaiser was finally convinced to abdicate. But before the official announcement could be made, events in Berlin forced the issue. Prince Max von Baden, the last imperial chancellor, was trying to manage the chaotic situation, but the streets of Berlin were filling with armed protesters. The Spartacists and other revolutionary groups were preparing for a decisive move. To head them off and prevent a communist takeover, Scheidemann, acting on his own initiative, made the fateful decision to declare the Republic. He stood on a balcony of the Reichstag building and without a moment's hesitation proclaimed, "The old and rotten monarchy has collapsed. The new has come to life. Long live the German Republic." The crowd below erupted in cheers. A few hours later, and from the balcony of the city palace, the Spartacist leader Karl Liebknecht countered this move by proclaiming a free socialist republic. The German people now had two competing visions of their future, both declared on the same day. One was a parliamentary republic, the other a Soviet republic. The struggle for the soul of the new Germany had officially begun. Historians still argue whether Scheidemann's preemptive declaration of the Republic was a brilliant strategic move that saved Germany from a more violent revolution, or a power grab that undermined the deeper, more radical potential of the workers' and soldiers' councils. The truth is, it cemented the Social Democrats' control over the revolution. Prince Max von Baden, seeing the situation was beyond his control, resigned and handed his office to Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the SPD. This act was technically unconstitutional, but in the chaos, such details were irrelevant. Ebert, a man who famously said he hated revolution like sin, was now the de facto leader of the revolutionary government. A true historical fact is that this transfer of power from a prince to a socialist leader marked the end of the Hohenzollern dynasty's centuries-long rule and the formal birth of the Weimar Republic, all within a single chaotic day. A lot happened that day, a real historical mic drop, if you will. With the old imperial structure crumbling, the power vacuum in Berlin was immense, and it was filled with a group of men who were perhaps the most reluctant revolutionaries in history. Friedrich Ebert, a man of moderate temperament and a deep-seated belief in order, found himself at the helm of the new German state. His first and most pressing task was to form a government, a process that had to be done with incredible speed to prevent the total descent into chaos that many feared. The Social Democratic Party, SPD, was the largest political force in Germany, but it was split. A left-wing faction, the Independent Social Democrats, USPD, had broken away earlier in the war, largely in protest of the SPD's support for the war effort. Now, in this moment of revolutionary fervor, Ebert knew he needed their support to present a united front against the more radical elements on the far left. So he formed a provisional government called the Council of the People's Deputies, a name that had a nice, revolutionary ring to it, while also sounding reassuringly official. This new council was comprised of 6 members, 3 from the SPD and 3 from the USPD. The idea was to create a joint leadership that could navigate the treacherous waters of the revolution. On paper, it seemed like a solid plan for a transitional government. But the reality was that the two groups had fundamentally different visions for the future of Germany. The SPD, led by Ebert, wanted to establish a parliamentary democracy as quickly as possible. Their goal was to hold elections for a national assembly, write a new constitution, and create a system based on universal suffrage and traditional political structures. They believed this was the only way to avoid a civil war and secure a stable future for Germany. The USPD, however, was more hesitant. They wanted to see the revolution continue, and for the workers' and soldiers' councils that had sprung up across the country to have more direct, lasting power. They were wary of a return to the old ways, fearing that a parliamentary system would simply be a facelift for the same old power structures. They were not against democracy per se, but they wanted a more socialist, council-based democracy. The tension between these two visions would define the coming months. Even as this fragile government was being assembled, the streets of Berlin remained a hub of revolutionary activity. The Spartacist League, led by the firebrand orators Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, was holding massive rallies. Their slogans called for a full-scale socialist revolution, a German version of what had happened in Russia. They wanted to see the immediate nationalization of industry, the disarming of the police and army, and all power handed over to the workers' councils. While a significant portion of the working class sympathized with their ideals, the Spartacists were a relatively small group, and crucially, did not have the organizational strength or popular support of the mainstream SPD. But their presence was a constant threat, and Ebert and his comrades were genuinely afraid of a violent coup. They looked at what had happened in Russia, the brutal civil war, the Red Terror, and were determined to prevent a similar fate for Germany. This fear of a communist takeover, it's a mainstream historical fact, heavily influenced every single decision the SPD government made in those early, chaotic days. The biggest challenge facing the new government, however, was not the revolutionaries on the left, but the old guard on the right. The Imperial Army, though defeated in the war, was still a powerful and well-organized force. The officer corps was deeply conservative and held little to no affection for the new socialist government. They were monarchists at heart, men who had sworn an oath to the Kaiser. They saw the revolution as a betrayal of Germany and a stain on its honor. The idea of serving under a government of socialists, led by a man like Ebert, who came from a working-class background, was deeply distasteful to them. For Ebert and his government, the army was an essential piece of the puzzle. They needed it to maintain order, to keep the country from dissolving into anarchy, and to, ironically, suppress the very revolutionaries who had helped bring them to power. The question was, could they trust the army, and could the army, in turn, be persuaded to support them? The answer would come in a secret, late-night phone call. On November 10th, 1918, just a day after the Republic was proclaimed, a secret deal was struck between Friedrich Ebert and General Wilhelm Groener, the chief of the Army's General Staff. Groener, having witnessed the collapse of the monarchy and recognizing the need for a stable government, offered the Army's support to the new Council of the People's Deputies. In return, Ebert and his government promised to maintain the traditional military command structure and to, crucially, suppress any radical leftist uprisings. This agreement, known as the Ebert-Groener Pact, was a landmark moment in the revolution. It was a deal with the devil in the eyes of many on the left. It gave the new republic a much-needed source of armed power, but it came at a very high price. It meant the old military elite, the very people who had been responsible for the catastrophic war and had supported the imperial regime, were now essentially guaranteed a place of continued power and influence in the new Germany. The pact was a pragmatic and, in some ways, a very cynical move. Ebert believed it was necessary to save the country from a more radical fate. The USPD members in the government, however, were kept completely in the dark about this agreement. When they found out later, the betrayal was palpable. Historians still argue whether the pact was a necessary evil that prevented a bloody civil war, or a fatal compromise that ultimately doomed the Weimar Republic by leaving the anti-democratic forces of the old military establishment untouched and ready to undermine the new government at every turn. It created a strange, lopsided political arrangement. The new government, born of a revolution, was now relying on the very forces that had been a pillar of the old regime to protect it from the radical elements of its own base. The stage was set for a confrontation, and it wouldn't be long in coming. With the Ebert-Groener Pact in place, a secret deal that bound the new socialist government to the old imperial military, Friedrich Ebert and his Council of the People's Deputies had a fighting chance to bring stability to Germany. However, their reliance on the very forces that had served the monarchy was a profound risk, one that alienated their more radical allies in the USPD and, of course, the Spartacist League. The government's most immediate challenge was to consolidate its authority, but the revolution was still very much a decentralized and chaotic affair. Throughout November, the workers' and soldiers' councils continued to spring up in cities, towns, and even rural areas. Some were moderate, supporting the new government and the call for a national assembly. Others were far more radical, calling for the abolition of the old state apparatus entirely and a direct democracy based on councils. This duality of power, with the official government in Berlin on one side and the myriad local councils on the other, was a defining characteristic of the revolution's early weeks. It created a feeling of constant uncertainty, a sense that the ground was always shifting. While the government was trying to organize for a nationwide election, the far left, particularly the Spartacists, saw the councils as the legitimate power base of the new Germany. They viewed a national assembly as a bourgeois institution, a trap designed to derail the revolution. They believed that the workers, through their councils, should rule directly. This created a fundamental ideological chasm. One side was pulling toward a traditional parliamentary model, the other toward a more radical Soviet-style system. The Spartacists, led by the brilliant theoretician Rosa Luxemburg and the fiery orator Karl Liebknecht, used their newspaper, The Red Flag, to rail against the government and its compromises. Liebknecht, in particular, who had already proclaimed a free socialist republic from the balcony of the city palace, was a relentless critic of Ebert's policies. He argued that the revolution was being betrayed by its own leaders, who were too afraid to seize real power from the old elite. A central point of contention was the military. While Ebert was making his secret pacts, the Spartacists and other left-wing groups were advocating for the creations of a Red Guard, a revolutionary militia made up of armed workers that would replace the old army. This idea was anathema to Ebert and his government. They saw it as an invitation to civil war and a direct threat to their authority. So instead of a Red Guard, they sought to disarm the most radical elements and bring the remaining troops under their control. This led to the first of many violent clashes. In early December, there was a confrontation between soldiers and demonstrators near the Reichstag building. The government allied soldiers opened fire, killing 16 people. This act of violence, committed by forces loyal to the new government, was a major blow to the SPD's credibility with the working class and fueled the anger of the far left. It proved in the eyes of the Spartacists that Ebert's government was little more than a tool of the old order, willing to shed the blood of its own people to maintain control. The government's position was a tricky one, a historical tightrope act if ever there was one. They were a socialist government, but they were working with a conservative military to suppress other socialists. It's like a group of friends trying to redecorate a room, but they hire their old cranky landlord to kick out the other friends who have better ideas for the furniture. This approach, while seemingly pragmatic to Ebert, made him look like a traitor to the revolutionary cause. He was walking a very thin line, trying to balance the threat of a full-blown communist takeover with the danger of a right-wing military coup. His primary goal was to ensure the National Assembly elections could be held without major disruption, because he believed that was the only path to a legitimate and stable government. A true fact of this period is that the Ebert government was operating in a state of near constant crisis, with threats coming from every conceivable direction. They were never fully in control, but rather reacted to events as they unfolded. The atmosphere in Berlin grew more and more charged as the weeks passed. The streets were a strange mixture of jubilant celebration, heated political debate, intense standoffs. The political divisions were not just ideological, they were physical. There were daily demonstrations, some peaceful, some not, and the various political groups all had their own armed followers. The Spartacist League, though small, was incredibly vocal and seemed to have an outsized influence on the public mood, thanks in no small part to the magnetic personalities of Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Their vision of a Germany where the workers themselves governed, where all power flowed from the ground up, was a compelling one for many people who had been oppressed by the old imperial system for so long. They saw the councils as the purest form of democracy, a way to permanently break the power of the old elites. The SPD's call for a national assembly, while practical, felt like a retreat from the revolutionary spirit. For the workers on the street, it was a call to give up the power they had so recently seized. This fundamental conflict between council democracy and parliamentary democracy was the central drama of the entire revolution, and it would soon come to a head in a series of violent and tragic events. The first of these, the Christmas crisis, was just around the corner, and it would push the fragile coalition government to its breaking point. The ideological tension between the SPD's vision of a parliamentary democracy and the USPD's desire for a council republic came to a head at the First General Congress of Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, which convened in Berlin in mid-December 1918. This was a pivotal moment, a chance for the revolution's grassroots to decide the future of the new Germany. The Congress brought together over 400 delegates from all corners of the country. They represented the very councils that had sprung up so spontaneously in the wake of the naval mutiny. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of immense historical purpose, but also with deep-seated divisions. The Congress became, in effect, a referendum on the direction of the revolution. Friedrich Ebert and the SPD sent their representatives to make a clear case for a national assembly. They argued that only a democratically elected body representing all of Germany could create a legitimate and stable government. They warned that continuing the revolution through councils alone would lead to a descent into anarchy and a bloody civil war, a fear that was very much on their minds. The USPD delegates, on the other hand, argued for the continued primacy of the councils. They saw the National Assembly as a step backward, a move that would ultimately betray the revolutionary spirit and hand power back to the old bourgeois establishment. They believed the councils were the truest expression of the people's will. A crucial moment came when the Congress had to vote on the future course of the revolution. A majority of the delegates, many of whom were exhausted by the war and longed for stability, voted in favor of holding elections for a national assembly. The vote was a clear victory for the SPD and a crushing defeat for the USPD and the Spartacists, who had been pushing for a council republic. This decision was a powerful signal that the majority of Germany's revolutionary base preferred a path of reform and parliamentary democracy over radical, immediate social revolution. It validated Ebert's cautious approach and provided a measure of legitimacy to his government, a mainstream historical fact that often gets lost in the more dramatic stories of the Spartacist uprising that came later. It showed that the radical left was, for all its noise, a minority within the revolutionary movement. But the vote did not end the conflict. In fact, it only seemed to sharpen the divisions. The Spartacists, who had boycotted the Congress, saw the vote as proof of the SPD's betrayal. For them, it was clear that the revolution was being hijacked by those who were afraid to truly change society. They were more convinced than ever that the path to a genuine socialist Germany lay in direct action and armed insurrection, not in elections and parliamentary debates. The Congress also failed to address one of the most contentious issues, the future of the army. The delegates did pass a resolution to democratize the military, calling for the abolition of officer insignia and the establishment of soldiers' councils to oversee the armed forces. However, this was largely a symbolic gesture, as the government, bound by the Ebert-Groener Pact, had no intention of actually implementing these changes. This failure to reform the military would have lasting and devastating consequences for the Weimar Republic. The political climate continued to deteriorate in the weeks following the Congress. The USPD was increasingly at odds with its coalition partners in the SPD. They were uncomfortable with Ebert's growing reliance on the old military and his refusal to enact the kind of deep social and economic reforms they believed were necessary. The Spartacists were not waiting for the government to act. They were actively organizing protests and strikes, trying to reignite the revolutionary fervor that seemed to have waned slightly after the vote. The air in Berlin was thick with mistrust and mutual suspicion. It was a pressure cooker, and it was only a matter of time before it blew. One little-known fact that adds to the general sense of unease during this time is that the old imperial bureaucracy, from judges to civil servants largely remained in place. They simply switched their allegiance, or at least pretended to, and continued to run the day-to-day operations of the government. This meant that even as the political leadership had changed, the deep state remained, often working to undermine the very principles of the new republic. It was a classic example of meet the new boss, same as the old boss, but with a lot more paperwork involved. This made it even more difficult for the new government to enact real, meaningful change, and gave credence to the Spartacists' claim that the revolution was being sold out. The new republic was a fragile shell, and inside the old cogs were still turning. The stage was now set for the next, more violent chapter of the revolution. The USPD was on the verge of leaving the government. The Spartacists were agitating for a new uprising, and Abert was preparing to use his secret weapon, the Freikorps, to crush the rebellion. The brief, chaotic period of revolutionary unity was over, replaced by a tense and dangerous standoff. And it would all come to a head in the next few weeks, as a small incident would spiral into a full-blown crisis, and then into a tragedy from which the German left would never fully recover. With the momentum of the revolution now clearly favoring the more moderate path of parliamentary democracy, as confirmed by the General Congress of Councils, the provisional government under Friedrich Ebert felt emboldened to assert its authority. The problem, as they saw it, was the lingering presence of radical armed groups that were not under their direct control. Chief among these was the People's Naval Division, a group of sailors who had played a key role in the initial uprising and were now stationed at the Berlin City Palace, the former imperial residence. They were a bit like that cool friend who helped you move in, but now refuses to leave your couch. They were a symbol of the revolution from below, and their continued existence was a thorn in the side of the SPD government, which was desperate to prove it could maintain law and order. The government wanted to disband the division and bring all armed forces in Berlin under the command of the new war minister, a move that was both a practical necessity and a political statement. The sailors, however, resisted. They saw themselves as the guardians of the revolution and had no intention of handing over their weapons to a government they no longer fully trusted, especially after the fatal shooting of demonstrators in early December. The situation escalated into a tense standoff. On December 23, 1918, the government cut off food and water to the palace, hoping to starve the sailors into submission. This was a spectacularly bad idea. Instead of giving up, the sailors captured the commander of the Berlin garrison and then surrounded the chancellery, trapping Friedrich Ebert and the other members of the Council of the People's Deputies inside. The situation was surreal. The head of the new government was a hostage in his own office. The Christmas holidays were about to be anything but peaceful. For Ebert, this was the moment of truth. He had to show he was in control. He made a desperate phone call to his secret ally, General Groner. The general, true to the terms of the Ebert-Groner Pact, sent in troops from the old imperial army to rescue the government. The fighting that ensued was brief but bloody. The sailors, though outgunned, put up a fierce resistance, and the gunfire from the regular army's assault damaged the historic palace. When the smoke cleared, several people were dead on both sides, but the government forces had failed to dislodge the sailors. An infuriated crowd of armed workers and civilians, drawn by the sound of the fighting, arrived on the scene, and the regular army troops, unnerved by the sight of their fellow citizens, withdrew. The government was rescued, but the crisis was a public relations disaster. It showed that Abert was willing to use violence against the very people who had put him in power, and it exposed his dependence on the old, conservative military. This Christmas crisis had two major consequences. First, it completely shattered the fragile alliance between the SPD and the USPD. The USPD leaders, who were still part of the government, were outraged by Abert's decision to use the military. They had not been consulted, and they saw it as a flagrant violation of the revolutionary spirit. A true historical fact is that the USPD ministers resigned from the Council of the People's Deputies in protest, effectively ending the socialist coalition. This left the SPDs to govern alone, but it also pushed the USPD closer to the radical left. The second consequence was that it gave the Spartacists and other hardline left-wing groups a powerful rallying cry. They could now point to the Christmas fighting as definitive proof that Abert's government was nothing more than a front for the old military establishment. The betrayal, in their eyes, was complete. The atmosphere in Berlin in the final days of 1918 and the first days of 1919 was one of almost unbearable tension. The political parties were not just arguing, they were on the brink of armed conflict. The Spartacists, feeling a renewed sense of purpose after the failure of the government's assault, called for mass protests and strikes. They were convinced that the time for a full-scale, armed revolution had finally arrived. The government, now stripped of its USPD members, was more isolated than ever, and its reliance on the military was no longer a secret. The officers of the old army and the newly formed right-wing paramilitary units, known as the Freikorps, were now the government's only real protection. This alliance was a marriage of convenience, to be sure, but it was one that would have deadly consequences. Historians still argue whether the Christmas crisis was a turning point that made the later, more violent January uprising inevitable. Some say that by using force and alienating his USPD allies, Abert pushed the revolution's more radical elements into a corner from which they could only respond with violence. Others say that the Spartacists were always going to launch an uprising and that the crisis simply provided a convenient excuse. Regardless of the exact cause and effect, the events of Christmas 1918 irrevocably poisoned the political atmosphere. The gentle, almost peaceful early days of the revolution were over, and a new, more brutal chapter was about to begin. The stage was set for the tragic showdown that would follow, a showdown that would define the rest of the German Revolution of 1918-1919, with the Christmas crisis exposing the deep rift between the moderate and radical wings of the German left. The SPD-led government was now a government on its own, its USPD coalition partners having walked out in disgust. This left the SPD in a precarious position, relying almost entirely on the goodwill of the old military establishment to maintain order. The vacuum left by the USPD's departure was quickly filled by the Spartacist League, who saw the recent events as a clear sign that the time for a full-scale, armed revolution was at hand. They believed the working class had been betrayed, and their only recourse was to seize power directly. But before they could act, their most prominent leaders were busy with a foundational project of their own. At a Congress from December 30th, 1918 to January 1st, 1919, the Spartacist League has formally transformed itself into a new political entity, the Communist Party of Germany, or KPD. This was a hugely significant moment. It marked the formal and final break between the radical left and the mainstream socialists. The Spartacists, under the guiding hand of Rosa Luxemburg, had always been wary of forming a traditional political party, fearing it would lead to a rigid bureaucracy and a betrayal of the revolutionary spirit. She preferred to see the revolution as a spontaneous, organic movement of the masses. But Karl Liebknecht and others were convinced that a formal party was necessary to organize and lead the workers toward a socialist future. The formation of the KPD was a compromise, but it also set the stage for a more direct and ultimately tragic confrontation with the government. The KPD's platform was clear: the immediate overthrow of the Ebert government, the abolition of the National Assembly, and the establishment of a council republic. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the political atmosphere was a powder keg, and the government, in an act that seemed either calculated or incredibly foolish, decided to light the fuse. On January 4th, 1919, Ebert's government fired Emil Eichhorn, the Berlin police chief. Eichhorn was an independent socialist, USPD, who had sided with the sailors during the Christmas crisis and was seen by the government as a dangerous ally of the far left. His dismissal was an open challenge to the USPD and the KPD, a final act to consolidate power in the hands of the new government. The response was immediate. The USPD and the KPD called for a mass demonstration in protest. On Sunday, January 5th, hundreds of thousands of workers poured into the streets of Berlin. They were armed, angry, and ready to fight. They occupied the offices of several newspapers, including the Vorwärts, the main newspaper of the Social Democrats, which they accused of spreading anti-revolutionary propaganda. The leaders of the KPD, including Karl Liebknecht, were caught off guard by the sheer scale of the protest. The spontaneous anger of the working class was far greater than they had anticipated. This was a classic moment in history where the leaders followed the masses rather than the other way around. Liebknecht, swept up in the revolutionary fervor, began to advocate for an immediate armed uprising. Rosa Luxemburg, however, was far more cautious. She saw that the working class was armed and angry, but she also knew they were not a disciplined or organized force. She believed the uprising was premature, that it would be a bloody and futile gesture that would only result in the destruction of the revolutionary movement. Historians still argue whether the decision to proceed with the January uprising was a tragic error of judgment on the part of the KPD leadership or an inevitable outcome of the radicalizing political climate. Despite Luxemburg's warnings, the uprising began. It was a chaotic and uncoordinated affair from the start. A revolutionary committee was formed, composed of representatives from the USPD, the KPD, and other radical groups, but they had no clear strategy or chain of command. The workers had seized key buildings, but they were not prepared for a sustained fight. Their goal was to topple the government, but they had no plan for what would come after, and they didn't have the support of the main body of the army. Their uprising was more of a passionate, spontaneous outburst than a calculated military move. The government, on the other hand, was preparing to act with ruthless efficiency. Ebert and his war minister, Gustav Noske, had a plan. Noske, a tough, no-nonsense man who had famously declared, "Someone must be the bloodhound. I won't shirk the responsibility," was given a free hand to suppress the uprising. He did not use the regular army, which was still seen as a liability, but instead relied on the newly formed Freikorps. These were volunteer paramilitary units made up of former soldiers, right-wing nationalists, and unemployed youth. They were often heavily armed, fiercely anti-communist, and loyal to no one but themselves and their commanders. They were the government's secret weapon, a force with no ties to the old imperial army, but with all of its brutal efficiency. The Freikorps moved into Berlin in the second week of January, and they did not come to negotiate. The fighting was short and one-sided. The poorly organized and lightly armed revolutionaries were no match for the professional, well-equipped Freikorps. They quickly retook the occupied buildings, and their suppression of the uprising was merciless. It was a swift, brutal, and bloody end to the revolution in Berlin. A true historical fact of the January uprising, often called the Spartacist uprising, is that while it was led by elements of the KPD's own leadership, including Luxembourg, had not fully supported it, making it an act of revolutionary desperation rather than a coordinated coup. The uprising's tragic conclusion would have even more tragic consequences for its most prominent leaders. The so-called Spartacist uprising in Berlin, a spontaneous and disorganized act of desperation rather than a coordinated revolutionary plan, was over almost as quickly as it began. The government's decision to bring in the Freikorps had been a brutal but effective one. These paramilitary units, composed of hardened nationalist veterans, had no compunction about using overwhelming force against what they saw as traitors and Bolsheviks. The fighting was not a battle between two armies. It was a massacre. The Freikorps systematically rooted out the revolutionaries, and in the process, they showed a level of ruthlessness that horrified even some of the government's allies. Once they had secured the occupied buildings and quelled the last pockets of resistance, they began a wave of reprisals. The defeat of the uprising was complete by mid-January, leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. But the most significant and most tragic chapter of this bloody episode was yet to be written. The leaders of the KPD, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, had gone into hiding as the uprising collapsed, knowing they were now the most wanted people in Germany. They had been against the uprising from the start, but they had felt it was their duty to stand by the workers once the fighting began. On the evening of January 15th, 1919, they were found and arrested at a safe house in Berlin. They were taken to the headquarters of the Freikorps Division of the Guard Cavalry Rifle Corps, located in the Hotel Eden. What happened next remains one of the darkest and most controversial events of the entire revolution. The two revolutionaries were interrogated, and according to a later investigation, beaten and abused. Then, in the early hours of January 16th, they were led away. Karl Liebknecht was taken from the hotel, and as he was being driven away in a car, he was shot and killed. The official story was that he was shot while trying to escape, but the evidence, including his body being found with multiple bullet wounds and no sign of a struggle, pointed to an extrajudicial murder. Rosa Luxemburg's fate was even more gruesome. She was also taken from the hotel, but she was struck on the head with a rifle butt, then shot in the head, and her body was thrown into the Landwehr Canal. Her body would not be found until May. The murders were a clear act of political assassination, designed to decapitate the German communist movement. The Freikorps soldiers responsible for the killings were later tried, but they received laughably light sentences, and in some cases were even acquitted. A true fact about this grim episode is that the murder of Liebknecht and Luxemburg was a turning point for the left. It created a deep, permanent sense of mistrust between the Social Democrats and the Communists, a divide that would never fully heal and would plague the Weimar Republic for its entire short life. The deaths of Liebknecht and Luxemburg had a profound and lasting impact. For the Communists, they became martyrs, and their murders became a rallying cry against the betrayal of the SPD government. For the Social Democrats, their use of the Freikorps and their failure to hold the murderers accountable was an indelible stain on their reputation. It showed that they were willing to use any means necessary, even murder, to crush their political rivals. It was a moment that poisoned the well of German politics, ensuring that the two largest parties on the left would remain bitter enemies. The German left, which had been so unified in its fight against the Kaiser, was now split, and this division made it tragically easy for other, more nefarious forces to rise to power in the years to come. Amid this violent chaos, the elections for the National Assembly, the very thing that Ebert had fought so hard to secure, went ahead as planned. On January 19, 1919, Germans went to the polls in the first democratic elections in the nation's history. The results were a resounding endorsement of the moderate path. The SPD emerged as the largest party, but they did not have an absolute majority. They were forced to form a coalition with the Catholic Center Party and the German Democratic Party, two middle-of-the-road, pro-Republican parties. The new government was a clear rejection of both the extreme left and the extreme right. The National Assembly met not in Berlin, which was still too volatile, but in the peaceful city of Weimar. And so, the new German state was born, the Weimar Republic. Historians still argue whether the murder of Liebknecht and Luxemburg, coming just days after the failed uprising, was the moment when the German Revolution truly ended. It was not the end of all violence, of course, as we will see, but it was certainly the end of the hope for a truly radical socialist Germany. The forces of moderation had won, and the forces of radical change had been not just defeated, but brutally and unforgivably destroyed. The murders cast a long, dark shadow over the entire Weimar period, serving as a constant reminder of the violence and political divisions that were baked into the Republic from its very first days. The country had, in a sense, sacrificed its most revolutionary figures on the altar of stability. Even as the Weimar National Assembly convened in the peaceful city of Weimar to begin the work of creating a new democratic constitution, the revolution was far from over. The events in Berlin were just one part of a wider nationwide struggle, the most dramatic and, in many ways, bizarre continuation of the revolution took place far to the south in the German state of Bavaria. Here, the monarchy had been deposed relatively peacefully in November, and the independent Social Democrat, USPD, Kurt Eisner had declared a republic. But Eisner's government was fragile, caught between the demands of the conservative Bavarian population and the radicalizing left. In February 1919, Eisner, on his way to the National Assembly, was assassinated by a right-wing nationalist named Anton Graf von Arco of Valley. The murder was a devastating blow to the Bavarian government and plunged the state into even deeper chaos. The assassination of Eisner, much like the murder of Liebknecht and Luxemburg, served to push the revolution in Bavaria to a more extreme and ultimately tragic conclusion. The moderate elements of the Bavarian government lost control, and the radical left took advantage of the power vacuum. In April 1919, a group of radical socialists and pacifist intellectuals declared the establishment of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. It was an attempt to create a council-based state, a kind of utopian, intellectual version of the Russian Revolution. The Republic was led by figures like the playwright and journalist Ernst Toller and the anarchist Gustav Landauer. They were more poets and thinkers than practical revolutionaries, and their vision for the new state was a strange mixture of socialist ideals, pacifism, and bohemian dreams. The first incarnation of the Bavarian Soviet Republic was short-lived and marked by a kind of surreal idealism. They were not ruthless, hardened revolutionaries, but rather a group of well-meaning, if somewhat naive, intellectuals. They issued decrees about the decentralization of government and the creation of a cultural ministry that would be open to all, but they failed to address the practical needs of the population, such as food shortages and rising unemployment. This idealistic phase lasted only a week before it was overthrown by a more radical and, importantly, more organized group of communists. This second wave of the Republic was led by hardline communists like Eugène Leviné, who had been a veteran of the Russian Revolution. This was a very different beast. Leviné and his followers were not interested in intellectual debates. They wanted a full-scale communist state, and they began to nationalize factories and form a Red Army. Their rule was far more authoritarian and ruthless than the one that preceded it. They began taking hostages, including members of the old government, and prepared for a showdown with the central government in Berlin. The government in Berlin, led by Friedrich Ebert, was not about to tolerate a communist state in its most important federal state. It was a direct challenge to their authority and their vision of a unified parliamentary Germany. The Weimar government, just as it had in Berlin, turned to the Freikorps to crush the rebellion. The Freikorps, who were now effectively the private army of the German state, were more than happy to oblige. They saw the Bavarian Soviet Republic not just as a political threat, but as an existential one. To them, the Bolsheviks in Munich represented a total betrayal of the German nation. A true historical fact of the Bavarian Soviet Republic is that it was not recognized by the central government, which considered the legitimate state government to be in exile in Bamberg. The stage was set for a bloody confrontation. The Freikorps, along with loyal army units, began their march on Munich. The fighting that ensued was brutal and one-sided. The Red Army of the Bavarian Soviet Republic was no match for the professional, well-equipped forces of the Freikorps. The city of Munich was subjected to a week of intense fighting, but by early May, the Freikorps had re-established control. The repression that followed was horrifying. The Freikorps, fueled by a mixture of anti-communism and nationalist fervor, engaged in a wave of mass arrests and executions. They executed hundreds of people, not just armed revolutionaries, but anyone they suspected of sympathizing with the communist cause. Gustav Landauer was brutally murdered, and many other leaders were either killed or imprisoned. The violence was a terrifying display of the power and ruthlessness of the German right. It was a clear signal that the new republic, while democratic on paper, was willing to use extreme violence to protect itself from the left. Historians still argue whether the events in Bavaria were a separate revolution or a kind of last gasp of the larger German Revolution of 1918-1919. What is certain is that the violent suppression of the Bavarian Soviet Republic and the murders of its leaders confirmed a pattern that had been established in Berlin. The new German Republic, born out of a revolutionary moment, was now entirely dependent on the very forces it was meant to replace, to protect it from its most radical elements. The revolution was, in many ways, eating itself. The defeat of the left in both Berlin and Munich left a political and ideological vacuum that would not go unnoticed. The vacuum would soon be filled by a very different kind of radicalism, a radicalism of the right. The stage was set for a new and even more dangerous chapter in German history, one that would begin with whispers of betrayal and end with a catastrophic rise to power. The violent suppression of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, following closely on the heels of the failed uprising in Berlin and the murders of Liebknecht and Luxemburg, marked a turning point. It was a clear sign that the Weimar government, despite being a democracy born of a revolution, was not afraid to use extreme violence to maintain order and protect itself from the far left. This period of intense conflict, however, was not the end of all revolutionary activity. Even after the main events in Berlin and Munich had subsided, Germany continued to be rocked by strikes and smaller, more localized uprisings. The revolutionary fervor, though weakened and pushed underground, had not completely disappeared. In the industrial heartland of the Ruhr region, for example, a wave of general strikes continued to plague the new republic well into the spring and summer of 1919. These strikes were not just about politics, they were about the very real suffering of the German working class. They were demanding better wages, shorter hours, and the nationalization of key industries, promises that many had been made during the revolution's early days. The SPD-led government, now in a fragile coalition with more conservative parties, was caught in a difficult position. They wanted to deliver on some of these promises, but they were also terrified of further destabilizing the country and alienating their new allies. The government's response was often a mixture of negotiation and repression. While they did make some concessions, they also used the military and the Freikorps to break up strikes and arrest their leaders. The constant cycle of strikes and government crackdowns created a feeling of deep-seated bitterness and mistrust between the working class and the new republic. The violence was not confined to industrial regions. Throughout central Germany, a series of smaller communist-led uprisings occurred in cities like Leipzig and Halle. These were often short-lived, poorly organized, and quickly crushed by the Freikorps. The brutal efficiency with which these uprisings were put down solidified the Freikorps' role as the government's de facto enforcers. They were a law unto themselves, operating with little oversight and often engaging in acts of summary execution and brutal repression. For many on the left, this was definitive proof that the new republic was just a continuation of the old, repressive state, but with a new face. It's a classic example of an unresolved conflict lingering and festering, much like a stubborn cough after you thought the cold was gone. The political and social unrest in 1919 was not a series of isolated incidents, but rather a symptom of the revolution's unfinished business. Historians still argue whether the constant strikes and uprisings of 1919 were a sign of a continuing revolutionary spirit or simply a series of desperate, uncoordinated last gasps. What is clear is that they weakened the new republic from the start. They consumed the government's resources, created a climate of fear and instability, and made it difficult for the National Assembly to focus on its primary task of writing a new constitution. The political landscape was a minefield, and the SPD-led government was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to navigate between the demands of the radical left and the threats from the far right. The moderate center, which was supposed to be the pillar of the new republic, was constantly under siege. A true historical fact of this period is that the constant turmoil and the government's reliance on the Freikorps to maintain order had a significant side effect. It effectively normalized political violence. The assassination of political leaders, the brutal suppression of protests, and the use of paramilitary units were no longer seen as extreme exceptions, but as a part of the political landscape. The line between politics and violence had become blurred, a dangerous precedent for the new republic. It made it much easier for extremist groups, both on the left and the right, to justify their own use of force in the future. The constant state of low-level civil war in 1919 created a deep sense of national exhaustion. People were tired of the fighting, the strikes, and the political instability. This exhaustion, ironically, worked in favor of the new government, as it created a widespread desire for stability and a willingness to accept compromises just to have a normal life again. The moderate parties, promising a return to order and a stable future, found a receptive audience. But this peace was a fragile one, built on the violent suppression of dissent and a series of unresolved grievances. The revolution had, in a sense, burned itself out, but it had left behind a smoldering landscape of bitterness and division. And those embers would one day be fanned back into a fire, but this time it would be a fire from the right. The stage was now set for the next major challenge to the new republic, a challenge that would come not from the workers' councils, but from the old military establishment itself. The revolution may have ended in defeat for the left, but the war for the soul of the new German Republic was far from over. While the revolutionary fire of the left was being violently extinguished, a different kind of movement was taking shape. The men who had been instrumental in crushing the communist uprisings were a motley and dangerous bunch. They were the Freikorps, a collection of volunteer paramilitary units formed from demobilized soldiers, disgruntled veterans, and young nationalist idealists. Their origins are rooted in the final days of the First World War. When the armistice was signed, the vast German army simply dissolved. Soldiers, many of whom had known nothing but the structured life of the military for 4 years, found themselves jobless and adrift in a country they no longer recognized. They were a lost generation, bitter about the war's outcome and the humiliation of defeat. The Treaty of Versailles had not yet been signed, but the impending peace felt to them like a national betrayal. These men were fiercely anti-communist, a sentiment that had been carefully cultivated by the army's leadership and the right-wing press. They saw the German Revolution as a stab in the back by socialist and Jewish traitors who had undermined the war effort from within. The Freikorps offered these men a new sense of purpose, a place to belong, and a chance to continue fighting for what they believed was the true Germany. They were often led by old imperial officers who, while a little dusty and out of place in the new republic, still commanded a certain loyalty. The Freikorps were not a single unified organization, but rather a collection of different units, each with its own commander and its own unique identity, but all sharing a common ideology of anti-communism and fervent nationalism. Friedrich Ebert and his government initially saw the Freikorps as a useful, if unsavory, tool. They were the only ones willing and able to suppress the violent uprisings of the radical left. They were the government's bloodhounds, a job that the regular army, still recovering from the war, was unwilling or unable to do. The Freikorps were given free rein to operate, and in return for their loyalty, they were largely left alone to do as they pleased. This was a profoundly dangerous arrangement. The government was, in effect, empowering a group of men who had no loyalty to the new democratic republic and who held deep contempt for the very values it was founded upon. It was like hiring a pack of wild wolves to protect your sheep from the coyotes. Sure, the wolves would deal with the coyotes, but they might also decide they prefer lamb for dinner. The Freikorps were instrumental in ending the revolution's most violent phase. They crushed the Spartacist uprising in Berlin and brutally suppressed the Bavarian Soviet Republic, and they did it with a level of ferocity that was shocking. They were not just fighting to restore order. They were fighting a political and ideological war. They saw themselves as the true defenders of the German nation against the Bolshevik plague, and they carried out their task with a chilling efficiency. Their actions cemented a pattern of political violence that would become a defining feature of the Weimar Republic. The Freikorps introduced an element of thuggery and brutalism into German politics that had not been there before, and they did it with the tacit approval of the government. A central historical fact about the Freikorps is that many of their members would go on to join other right-wing and nationalist movements, including the Nazi Party. Their commanders and their brutal political tactics would become a key part of the rise of German fascism. The Freikorps was, in a sense, a training ground for the next generation of political thugs. They taught them that political power came not just from votes, but from violence, intimidation, and the brutal suppression of dissent. They were a walking, talking, and very dangerous symbol of the old anti-democratic forces that were still very much alive and well in the new Germany. Historians still argue whether the Freikorps were a necessary evil that saved the country from a communist civil war, or a fatal mistake that introduced a level of political violence that ultimately doomed the Republic. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. They were a symptom of a deeply fractured and traumatized society, a generation of young men who were looking for a cause to believe in and a fight to be a part of. The revolution had given them a chance to find both, and the government, in its desperate search for stability, had given them the means to do it. The defeat of the left had created a vacuum of violence, and the Freikorps had willingly stepped in to fill it. They had won the battle against the left, but in doing so, they had unleashed a monster that the new republic would never be able to control. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, one that would come not from the far left, but from the forces of reaction and revanchism. While the violent events of the revolution were playing out on the streets of Berlin and Munich, the political process that would shape the new German state was taking place in the quiet, historic city of Weimar. The National Assembly, which had been elected on January 19th, 1919, was composed of delegates from a variety of political parties, but the overwhelming majority were committed to a democratic parliamentary republic. The SPD, having emerged as the largest single party, formed a coalition government with the Catholic Center Party and the German Democratic Party. This coalition, known as the Weimar Coalition, represented the moderate, pro-Republican forces in Germany, and their first order of business was to draft and ratify a new constitution. The man tasked with drafting the new constitution was Hugo Preuss, a liberal and a law professor. He and the National Assembly set about creating a document that was, on paper, one of the most progressive and democratic constitutions in the world at the time. It enshrined a wide range of civil liberties, including freedom of speech, press, and assembly, as well as universal suffrage for all men and women over the age of 20. It created a parliamentary system with a president, but the real power was vested in the Chancellor and the Reichstag, the new parliament. A key feature of the Weimar Constitution was a proportional representation, which meant that even small parties could win seats in the Reichstag. This was a very fair system, but it also had a major downside. It made it very difficult for any single party to gain a majority, which led to a constant succession of fragile coalition governments. Another significant element of the new constitution was Article 48, which gave the president the power to rule by decree in a state of emergency. This was intended as a safety valve, a way to deal with a crisis without having to go through the slow process of parliamentary debate. But it was a dangerous provision, a little bit like giving a babysitter an emergency panic button that also launches all the fireworks at once. It was a power that could and would be abused in the future, allowing the president to bypass the democratic process and rule as a virtual dictator. The Constitution, in a sense, contained the seeds of its own destruction. While the National Assembly was busy at work, the most prominent figure of the revolution, Rosa Luxemburg, was already a martyr. We talked about her murder a few sections back, but it's worth revisiting her political thought because she was far more than a revolutionary firebrand. Luxemburg was a brilliant Marxist theorist and a passionate advocate for democratic socialism. She believed that the revolution should not be led by a small, authoritarian vanguard party, as Lenin had argued, but should be a spontaneous, organic movement of the masses. Her famous quote, "Freedom is always the freedom of the dissenter," encapsulated her belief that a socialist state, to be truly free, had to be democratic and protect the rights of its opponents. She was a fierce critic of Lenin's authoritarianism and saw the Russian Revolution as a betrayal of true socialist ideals. She argued that the German Revolution had to be different, that it had to be a revolution from below, with power flowing from the workers' councils up, not from a small party down. Luxemburg's ideas were, in a sense, a roadmap to a different kind of revolution, one that was democratic and pluralistic. But she was a minority voice within her own party, and her ideas were ultimately ignored. She was murdered for her revolutionary convictions, but the revolution that followed her death was not the one she had envisioned. A true historical fact is that Luxemburg's political philosophy, particularly her critique of authoritarianism, has been a source of inspiration for democratic socialists and anti-authoritarian Marxists for decades. She was a complex and contradictory figure, an intellectual who believed in the power of the masses, a revolutionary who feared chaos, and a victim of the very violence she had warned against. The National Assembly ratified the new Constitution in August 1919. It was a monumental achievement, the formal birth of the Weimar Republic. It was, in many ways, a triumph of moderation and reason over the chaos and extremism that had defined the preceding months. The revolution, in its most violent and radical phase, was now officially over. The new republic had a framework, a set of rules, and a government. But the problems that had fueled the revolution, the deep social divisions, the bitterness of defeat, the simmering political violence, had not gone away. They were simply pushed beneath the surface, where they would fester and rot. The Weimar Republic was a democratic oasis in a desert of discontent, and its survival was far from guaranteed. The legacy of the revolution, a legacy of compromise and violence, would cast a long and troubled shadow over the new republic's short life. With the establishment of the Weimar Republic and the ratification of its new constitution, the political focus of Germany shifted from the revolutionary streets of Berlin to the halls of power. But as the new democratic government was trying to find its footing, a new and even more radical challenge arose. This time, it came not from the left, but from the far right. The Kapp Putsch was a right-wing coup attempt that demonstrated just how fragile the new republic was and how many enemies it still had in the old establishment. The immediate trigger for the putsch was the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty, which would be signed in June 1919, placed severe restrictions on the German military. Under its terms, the army, or Reichswehr, had to be drastically reduced in size, and many of the Freikorps units had to be disbanded. The Freikorps, who had just spent the last year saving the government from the communists, were now told they were no longer needed. They were outraged. They saw the treaty as a national humiliation and the government as a group of weak traitors who were selling out Germany. Their anger was shared by many in the old imperial army, who saw the military reductions as an attack on their honor and their institution. The coup was led by Wolfgang Kapp, a right-wing civil servant and a fervent nationalist, and General Walter von Lüttwitz, a Freikorps commander and a high-ranking officer in the army. On the night of March 12, 1920, the Marine Brigade Ehrhardt, a powerful Freikorps unit, marched on Berlin. They were a menacing sight, with their steel helmets and swastika symbols painted on them, a clear signal of the kind of ideology they represented. They had come to overthrow the Weimar government. The regular army, which was supposed to defend the Republic, was now put to the test. The government's defense minister, Gustav Noske, who had used the Freikorps to crush the left, now asked the army to fight them. But the army's commander, General Hans von Seeckt, refused, famously saying, "Troops do not fire on troops." It was a clear and devastating betrayal. The government had no military support. Faced with a military coup and no army to defend them, the Weimar government, including President Ebert, was forced to flee Berlin. They went first to Dresden and then to Stuttgart, a symbolic flight that showed just how little control they had. The putschists took over the city and installed Wolfgang Kapp as the new chancellor. The coup, however, was a total failure. It failed not because of military resistance, but because of civilian defiance. The legitimate government, before it left Berlin, had called for a general strike. The trade unions, the civil service, and millions of ordinary German workers answered the call. They paralyzed the country. The trains stopped running, the power plants went dark, and the bureaucracy ground to a halt. Kapp and his co-conspirators were a government in name only. They could not govern a country that had simply refused to work for them. The putsch collapsed after just a few days. Wolfgang Kapp fled, and the Freikorps, facing a total lack of support and a unified civilian population, simply melted away. The government returned to Berlin, and the crisis was averted. The defeat of the Kapp putsch was a major victory for the new republic, and a powerful testament to the strength of its democratic institutions, and more importantly, the power of organized labor and civil society. A true historical fact of the Kapp putsch is that its failure demonstrated that the old military elite, while powerful, could not rule without the support of the civilian population. It was a clear signal that the Republic, despite its many flaws, had a popular base of support that the old guard simply did not. The Kapp putsch, however, had a dark side. In the aftermath, the government once again was soft on the perpetrators. While the communists and socialists who had participated in the January Uprising were brutally suppressed, the right-wing putschists were often given light sentences, or in many cases simply returned to their old jobs. This double standard was deeply resented by the left and further poisoned the political atmosphere. It proved in the eyes of many that the new republic was a two-tiered system, one for its friends on the right and a very different one for its enemies on the left. The Kapp putsch was a kind of dress rehearsal for future right-wing attempts to seize power. It showed them that a frontal assault on the government was a bad idea and that they would need to find a new way to gain power. a way that did not rely on a direct military confrontation. The lesson learned would be a dangerous one. The failure of the Kapp Putsch was a major victory for the Weimar Republic, but it was also a warning sign. It showed that while the government had a surprising level of civilian support, it had little to no support from the military establishment, and that this establishment was willing to betray the Republic to protect its own interests. The putsch was a clear demonstration of the threat posed by the Freikorps, the very same paramilitary groups that the government had used to crush the left. We have mentioned them before, but they are so central to the story of the revolution and its aftermath that we must take a closer look at who they were and why they were so dangerous. The Freikorps were not a new invention in 1918. They had a long history in German-speaking lands, dating back to the Napoleonic Wars. They were, as the name implies, Freikorps of volunteer soldiers. The Freikorps of 1918 to 1919, however, were something entirely different. They were born out of a sense of national humiliation and personal disorientation. The young men who joined them were a part of what was later called the Lost Generation. They had come of age in the trenches of the First World War, where they had learned to kill and to obey without question. When the war ended, they found themselves in a civilian society they no longer understood, and that in their eyes no longer understood them. They were told the war was lost, but they had not been defeated in the field. They were told that the Kaiser had abdicated and that a new republic had been born, but they felt no loyalty to it. The Freikorps offered these men a new purpose. It was a place where they could continue to fight, where the brutal camaraderie of the trenches could be recreated. They were fiercely anti-communist, an ideology that had been fueled by the war and the Russian Revolution. They saw the German Revolution as a communist betrayal of the nation, and they were more than happy to be the instrument of its suppression. They were a motley crew, a strange mixture of officers from the old imperial army, right-wing students, and unemployed workers. They were well armed and well disciplined, but their loyalty was not to the state. It was to their commanders and to their own twisted sense of nationalism. The government, in its desperation to restore order, made a pact with these units. It was an unholy alliance, a deal with the devil. The government gave the Freikorps a free hand to suppress the left, and in return the Freikorps would maintain order. The result was a wave of brutal violence. The Freikorps were not just soldiers, they were political enforcers. They killed not just in battle, but in cold blood. The murders of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the brutal suppression of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, and the summary executions of countless workers and revolutionaries were all carried out by the Freikorps. A true historical fact is that the Freikorps were a parallel army, a shadow state. They were armed and trained and operated with a kind of impunity that was deeply corrosive to the new republic. They showed that in the new Germany, political power came from the barrel of a gun. The government had used them to defeat the left, but in doing so, it had legitimized their existence and their brutal tactics. When the government, in a moment of sanity, tried to disband them after the Kapp Putsch, many of the members simply went underground or joined other right-wing nationalist groups. Many of the most brutal and effective commanders of the Nazi stormtroopers The SAC were former Freikorps leaders. The Freikorps were a finishing school for the thugs who would one day try to destroy the very republic they had helped to create. Historians still argue whether the Freikorps were an inevitable consequence of the social and political turmoil of the time or a unique and dangerous phenomenon. What is certain is that they represented a deep sickness in German society, a sickness that was born in the trenches of the First World War and was given a new life in the chaos of the German Revolution. They were a constant threat to the Republic's stability and a symbol of its deepest and most intractable contradictions. The government had defeated the left, but in doing so, it had unleashed a monster on the right that it would never be able to fully control. The legacy of the Freikorps was not just the dead bodies they left behind, but the normalization of political violence and the creation of a powerful, well-armed, and deeply anti-democratic force that would come back to haunt Germany in the years to come. The German Revolution of 1918-1919 was, in a sense, the German people's final word on the First World War. It was a chaotic and violent conclusion to a catastrophic conflict, a series of events that saw a centuries-old empire collapse and a new democratic republic rise in its place. But the revolution was not just about the fall of the Kaiser and the birth of the Weimar Republic. It was also about the deep ideological struggle for the soul of the new Germany. That struggle ended in victory for the moderate, parliamentary-style democracy, but the manner in which it was won would cast a long and troubled shadow. The SPD-led government had defeated the far left, but it had done so at the cost of alienating a significant portion of the working class and by empowering the very anti-democratic forces that would later seek to destroy it. The legacy of the German Revolution is, therefore, a complex and contradictory one. On one hand, it was a success. It overthrew a hereditary monarchy and replaced it with a democratic parliamentary republic based on a progressive constitution that gave women the right to vote for the first time. It established a government that, for all its flaws, was committed to the rule of law and the peaceful transfer of power. It was a revolution that avoided a full-scale civil war of the kind that was ravaging Russia. For that, Friedrich Ebert and his government deserve a certain amount of credit. They were pragmatic men who sought to bring stability to a country on the brink of collapse. On the other hand, the revolution was also a profound failure. It failed to fundamentally change the power structures of the old imperial state. The military, the judiciary, and the civil service, the very pillars of the old empire, remained largely intact. The conservative officer corps of the army, which had refused to defend the republic during the Kapp Putsch, was allowed to remain in power. The judges, who had served the Kaiser, continued to mete out justice, and they showed a clear bias, often giving lenient sentences to right-wing political assassins while being brutally harsh on their left-wing counterparts. The bureaucracy, filled with men who had no love for the new republic, continued to operate as it always had. This was not a revolution that cleaned house. It was a revolution that simply changed the people in the top jobs, leaving the old anti-democratic machinery to continue running. This failure to dismantle the old power structures meant that the new republic was always being undermined from within. The forces of reaction and revanchism were not just outside the gates, they were in the very halls of government. The Freikorps, who had helped save the Republic from the Communists, were now a constant threat to its stability, and many of their members would go on to join the Nazi Party. The German Revolution, in a sense, had not ended the war between the old Germany and the new. It had just moved it from the battlefield to the political arena, where it would be fought with words, lies, and increasingly violence. A central historical fact of the revolution is that its incomplete nature led to a deep-seated sense of betrayal on both the left and the right. The left felt that the revolution had been sold out by the SPD, who had used the military and the Freikorps to crush their hopes for a more radical socialist Germany. The right, meanwhile, felt that Germany had been stabbed in the back by the very revolutionaries who had brought down the Kaiser, and that the new republic was a foreign, un-German institution. These two opposing narratives, both fueled by resentment and a sense of betrayal, created an environment of bitter political polarization that would plague the Weimar Republic for its entire existence. It was a republic born out of conflict, and it would never be able to escape it. Historians still argue whether the German Revolution's legacy was more positive or negative. Was it a pragmatic compromise that saved Germany from a bloody civil war, or was it a fatal mistake that laid the groundwork for the rise of Nazism? The truth is that it was both. It gave Germany a taste of democracy and freedom, but it also left the country with a lingering sense of unresolved conflict. The revolution had created a new German state, but it had not created a new German society. The old hatreds and divisions were still there, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to boil over again. The stage was set for the next chapter, a chapter that would be defined by the harsh realities of the post-war world and the deep resentments left over from the revolution itself. The German Revolution of 1918-1919 was, in a sense, an internal German affair, a chaotic family fight over the future of the nation. But even as the fighting raged, a larger, more menacing force was at work. The Allied powers, having won the First World War, were now ready to impose their peace. The signing of the armistice on November 11th, 1918, had ended the fighting, but it had not ended the war. The victors still had a price to be paid, and the burden would fall on the fragile new republic. The stage for this final and perhaps most devastating act was the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris, where the leaders of the Allied nations gathered to negotiate the terms of a treaty that would define the rest of the 20th century. For the German people, the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were a brutal shock. They had surrendered, but they believed it was on the basis of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, a set of principles that promised a just and fair peace. Instead, what they got was a Carthaginian peace, a peace designed to punish and humiliate. The treaty was incredibly harsh, and its terms can be broken down into three main categories. First, there were the territorial losses. Germany was forced to give up vast swathes of its territory, including the regions of Alsace-Lorraine to France, Upper-Malmedy to Belgium, and large portions of its eastern lands to a newly independent Poland. This was a profound loss, a dismemberment of the German nation that was deeply resented by all political stripes from the left to the far right. Second, there were the military restrictions. The German army was to be drastically reduced to a mere 100,000 men. The navy was to be limited to a few ships, and the air force was to be completely abolished. This was a crippling blow to a nation that had for so long prided itself on its military prowess. It was an attack on German honor, and it was deeply humiliating. This was the provision that had led to the Kapp Putsch, as the Freikorps and the military elite refused to accept these terms. A true historical fact of the treaty is that these restrictions would ironically make it easier for the old officer corps to maintain control of the army, as they could simply fill the ranks with their most loyal and trusted men, creating a kind of private, professional army that was loyal to them, not to the Republic. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there was the Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. This article forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the outbreak of the war. It was a moral and legal condemnation, a psychological blow that was felt across the nation. It was also the justification for the enormous reparations that Germany would be forced to pay to the Allies, a staggering sum of money that was designed to cripple the German economy for decades to come. To the German people, who had been told they were fighting a defensive war, the War Guilt Clause was a lie, a final act of humiliation. They had not been invited to the negotiations, and they were presented with a treaty that was in effect a dictate. The German government, having no other choice, was forced to sign it in June 1919. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles was a devastating blow to the young Weimar Republic. It gave its enemies on both the left and the right a powerful rallying cry. The right could now say, "We told you so." The November criminals, the socialists, and Jews who betrayed us have now signed a treaty that has humiliated and dismembered our nation. This was the core of the pernicious stab in the back myth, which we will discuss more in the next section. The left could argue that the government, in its rush to compromise and its failure to enact a true revolution, had left Germany weak and defenseless in the face of the Allied powers. The treaty, therefore, did more than just harm Germany economically and militarily. It fatally wounded the legitimacy of the new republic in the eyes of many Germans. The revolution, which had been fought to create a better Germany, had instead resulted in a treaty that many saw as a national catastrophe. The legacy of the revolution, a legacy of internal division and compromise, had now been cemented by an external force, and the fragile new republic would have to live with the consequences. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and in particular the War Guilt Clause, was a devastating political blow to the new Weimar Republic. It gave its opponents a weapon far more powerful than any a revolution could produce, a story. This story, which would become the central myth of the German right, was known as the stab in the back myth, or the Dolchstoßlegende. It was a narrative so powerful and so pernicious that it would poison the political atmosphere for the entire life of the Republic and ultimately contribute to its downfall. The myth was simple, elegant, and completely untrue. It claimed that the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield. It was a remarkable claim, given the reality of the front in late 1918, where the army was in full retreat and on the verge of total collapse. The myth instead posited that the army, which had been fighting so bravely for 4 years, had been stabbed in the back by treacherous civilians at home. The culprits were named with a chilling specificity: the socialists who had organized the strikes, the pacifists who had opposed the war, and most virulently, the Jews, who were blamed for everything from war profiteering to Bolshevism. The very people who had brought about the revolution and created the new republic were now being blamed for the nation's defeat. The myth was a political masterstroke. It was created and promoted by the very people who had been responsible for the war in the first place, the old military elite. General Erich Ludendorff, the man who had been the de facto dictator of Germany for the last 2 years of the war and had demanded an immediate armistice, was one of its most ardent promoters. He and other right-wing figures found it far more convenient to blame an internal conspiracy than to admit that their own military strategy had failed. It was a way to shift the blame for a lost war from the military to the civilian government, and in doing so, to delegitimize the new democratic republic from its very first days. The stab in the back myth was a powerful tool because it tapped into a deep well of national resentment and humiliation. The German people had been told for 4 years that they were winning the war. They had been subjected to relentless propaganda about a final victory. The sudden and total collapse of the home front, followed by the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, was a psychological shock that was difficult to process. The myth provided a comforting, if conspiratorial, explanation for their defeat. It was easier to believe that they had been betrayed by an internal enemy than to accept the harsh reality that they had simply lost the war. The myth had devastating consequences for the new republic. It made it impossible for the government to gain a sense of true legitimacy. Every political act, from signing a treaty to trying to enforce law and order, was viewed by the right as a continuation of this national betrayal. The Republic's political opponents, particularly on the far right, could now argue that the entire system was corrupt and illegitimate, a foreign imposition on the German nation. The myth was also deeply anti-Semitic, a fact that cannot be ignored. The portrayal of Jews as traitors who had undermined the war effort was a central element of the narrative and a powerful precursor to the anti-Semitism that would define the Nazi era. A true historical fact of the myth is that it became a central pillar of Adolf Hitler's political rhetoric and a key part of his race to power. Historians still argue whether the stab-in-the-back myth was a unique German phenomenon or a predictable consequence of a nation losing a war they believed they were winning. What is clear is that it was not just a historical lie. It was a psychological weapon. It poisoned the political atmosphere and ensured that the Weimar Republic would always be fighting for its life. The revolution may have ended the war and created a new state, but it had not ended the conflict between the old Germany and the new. It had simply moved it from the battlefield to the political stage, where a new and even more insidious battle was being fought. A battle of narratives and historical lies. And in that battle, the young republic was ill-equipped to win. The legacy of the revolution was not just the Constitution and the new government, but the deep-seated resentment and the historical lies that would one day consume it. The German Revolution may have ended with the establishment of the Weimar Republic, but its legacy was a political climate of profound instability. The period from 1919 to the mid-1920s was a constant struggle for the new government, a relentless fight against threats from both the far left and the far right. The political landscape was a minefield, littered with unresolved conflicts and simmering resentments. The government was constantly on the defensive, trying to navigate between a left that saw it as a tool of the old establishment and a right that saw it as a traitor to the nation. This created a political environment that was not just polarized, but fundamentally broken. The violence did not end with the defeat of the Spartacist and Bavarian uprisings. Political assassination became a regular feature of German public life. High-profile politicians who were seen as symbols of the Republic, particularly those who had signed the armistice or the Treaty of Versailles, were targeted by right-wing death squads, often made up of former Freikorps members. The most shocking of these was the murder of Matthias Erzberger, a Catholic Center Party politician who had signed the armistice in 1921. Even more devastating was the assassination of Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau in 1922. Rathenau was a brilliant industrialist and a prominent Jewish politician who was trying to navigate Germany's difficult relationship with the Allied powers. His murder was a clear signal that the far right would not tolerate anyone who sought to work within the new system. These assassinations, a true historical fact, were often met with shockingly lenient sentences from the judiciary, which was still filled with conservative judges who were sympathetic to the nationalist cause. This double standard only deepened the sense of injustice and illegitimacy felt by the left. The constant political turmoil was exacerbated by a series of economic crises. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed a staggering burden of reparations, and the German economy, already weakened by the war, struggled to pay. The government resorted to printing more and more money to make the payments, which led to a catastrophic period of hyperinflation in 1923. The value of the German mark plummeted to absurd levels. A loaf of bread could cost millions, then billions of marks. People's life savings were wiped out overnight. This economic collapse was a profound psychological blow. It destroyed the middle class and left millions of people in a state of utter desperation. It created a feeling that the new republic was incapable of managing the country, and that the old system, for all its flaws, had at least been stable. This environment of economic collapse and political violence created fertile ground for extremist groups. On the left, the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, continued to agitate for a new revolution, though they were no longer a serious military threat. On the right, a myriad of small nationalist and anti-Semitic groups began to gain traction. They offered simple solutions to complex problems and a powerful conspiratorial narrative to explain all of Germany's ills. The most prominent of these was the fledgling Nazi Party, led by a little-known former soldier named Adolf Hitler. In 1923, inspired by the success of the Kapp Putsch, he attempted his own coup, the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. The putsch was a spectacular failure, but it showed that the forces of the far right were still a major threat. The political climate of the Weimar Republic was one of constant struggle. The moderate parties were trapped in a constant cycle of fragile coalition governments, unable to enact long-term structural reforms. The proportional representation system, while fair, made it nearly impossible to form a stable majority. Every election was a new round of political jockeying, and every government was a new, fragile compromise. A political joke of the time that was not so funny in reality was that Germany had more political parties than it had citizens with money. The deep-seated political divisions that had been unleashed by the revolution had not gone away. They had simply found a new home in the democratic system where they would be fought out not with cannons, but with words, lies, and when that failed, with fists and bullets. The Weimar Republic, in a sense, never had a chance to fully recover from its traumatic birth. The unresolved conflicts of the revolution continued to haunt it, and they would one day be its undoing. The German Revolution's most immediate and violent phase may have ended in 1919, but its ideological battles continued to rage, not just in Berlin, but in every corner of Germany. This ongoing political warfare was deeply rooted in the unresolved grievances of the revolution and the trauma of the lost war. The new Weimar Republic, for all its democratic promises, was still trying to find its footing on a very shaky foundation. One of the most significant and lasting of these ideological struggles was the ongoing tension between the left wing and the right wing. On the left, the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, now a formal political entity, remained committed to the goal of a socialist revolution. Their leaders, having witnessed the brutal murders of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and the violent suppression of their uprisings, were convinced that the SPD-led government was a tool of the bourgeoisie and would never truly serve the interests of the working class. They were a revolutionary party, not a parliamentary one, and they sought to undermine the Weimar Republic at every turn. They refused to work with the Social Democrats, whom they called social fascists, a fatal division that would make it impossible for the German left to form a united front against the rising tide of the far right. The KPD's message was a simple one. The revolution was not over, and the only way to achieve true freedom was through a second, more successful uprising. On the right, the old imperial establishment and a new generation of nationalists and revanchists were equally committed to destroying the Republic. They had their own narratives and their own paramilitary groups, the Freikorps and later the SA, to back them up. They saw the Weimar Republic as a stain on the German nation, a betrayal of its heroic past, and a sign of its moral decay. They yearned for a return to a more authoritarian form of government, one that was strong enough to restore German honor and power. They were not just content to criticize the government, they actively worked to undermine it through political assassination, sabotage, and the constant promotion of the stab in the back myth. This deep-seated political polarization created a constant state of low-level civil war. The government was always walking a tightrope, trying to appease one side without alienating the other. But in its efforts to find a middle ground, it often pleased no one. The constant shifting of fragile coalition governments, a result of the proportional representation system, made it impossible to enact the kind of long-term reforms that the country so desperately needed. The political leaders were too busy just trying to stay in power to actually govern. The economic crises of the early 1920s, particularly the hyperinflation of 1923, only added fuel to the fire, as millions of ordinary Germans lost faith in their government's ability to manage the country. It was a vicious cycle. Political instability led to economic crises, which in turn led to more political instability. Historians still argue whether this political polarization was an inevitable consequence of the revolution or if it was a failure of leadership. Was there a way for the SPD to have governed differently, to have reconciled with the left without alienating the right? We can only speculate. A central historical fact, however, is that this political climate, born out of the revolution, created the fertile ground in which Nazism would one day flourish. The German people, tired of the constant fighting, the economic crises, and the political bickering, were slowly becoming receptive to a message of national unity, strength, and decisive leadership. The vacuum created by the failure of the moderate center would one day be filled by the radical promises of the far right. The German Revolution, therefore, was not a single event, but a complex process with a long and troubled aftermath. It was a revolution that had successfully toppled an empire, but had failed to create a stable, unified nation. It had exposed the deep, festering wounds of German society, the deep-seated class divisions, the militaristic culture, the sense of national humiliation. And in its failure to heal those wounds, it left a legacy of bitterness, division, and unresolved conflict that would, in the end, lead to a far greater tragedy. The revolution, in a sense, never truly ended. It simply morphed into a new, more dangerous kind of political warfare. The German Revolution's failure to address the nation's deep-seated social and economic inequalities was one of its most profound and lasting failures. The revolution had been ignited by the suffering of the working class, by the hunger and desperation that had gripped the country during the long years of the war. They had been promised a new, more just society, one where the old class structures would be dismantled and the power would rest in the hands of the people. But the new Weimar Republic, in its rush to restore order and stability, failed to deliver on these promises. The result was a deep-seated sense of disappointment and betrayal that festered and became a source of political bitterness for years to come. One of the central issues that was never fully resolved was the question of land reform. In the old imperial Germany, much of the country's agricultural land was still held by a small number of aristocratic landowners, the Junkers. These men were a powerful and deeply conservative force, and they had no intention of giving up their land. The socialist parties, particularly the KPD, had called for a total redistribution of land to the peasants and farm workers. The SPD, in its new coalition government, was too afraid to take on the Junkers. They knew that such a move would alienate their new, more conservative partners and would likely lead to a new round of civil unrest. So they did very little. This failure to address the land question left the old agricultural elite in power and left the rural working class feeling betrayed by the revolution. It was a failure to change the very foundations of German society. Another key issue was the nationalization of industry. The socialist parties had long argued that the great industrial corporations which had grown immensely wealthy during the war, should be taken out of private hands and put under the control of the state. The idea was to create an economy that served the public good, not the profits of a few wealthy industrialists. The SPD, in its more moderate form, had also advocated for this, but once in power, they quickly backpedaled. They were afraid that nationalization would lead to economic chaos and would be opposed by their new coalition partners. Instead, they opted for a more moderate path of labor reforms, such as the 8-hour workday, which was a significant achievement but fell far short of the revolutionary promises. This failure to nationalize the mines and factories meant that the old industrial elite, who had supported the Kaiser and the war, remained a powerful force in the new republic. A true historical fact of the revolution is that the lack of fundamental economic change gave credence to the communist claim that the SPD had sold out the working class for a place in power. The unresolved economic and social issues created a deep and lasting divide between the working class and the new government. The workers, who had been on the front lines of the revolution, felt that they had been used and then abandoned. Their revolution had resulted in a political system that was still dominated by the same old elites, a government that was unwilling to address the very real issues of poverty and inequality. This sense of betrayal was a powerful force that drove many to support the more radical parties, both on the left and increasingly on the right. Historians still argue whether the SPD could have been more radical, whether it could have pushed for more fundamental changes without risking a full-blown civil war. It is an impossible question to answer. What is clear is that the revolution, for all its drama and violence, did not fundamentally transform German society. It was a political revolution, but not a social one. It changed the system of government, but it did not change the system of power. The old elites remained in place, and the old grievances remained unaddressed. This unfinished business of the German Revolution would fester beneath the surface for the entire life of the Weimar Republic, waiting for a chance to erupt again. The stage was set, and the actors were already in place. The curtain would rise on a new tragedy, a tragedy born out of the failures of the old. The German Revolution may have ended with the establishment of the Weimar Republic, but its final and perhaps most significant chapter was yet to be written. This chapter was not about the internal conflicts of the new state, but about the external pressures that would shape its destiny. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was a political time bomb, and it had a profound and lasting effect on the revolution's legacy. The treaty was seen by almost all Germans as a national humiliation, and it provided a powerful rallying cry for all the anti-democratic forces that had been defeated in the revolution. The revolution's leaders, the men who had created the republic, were now seen by a large portion of the population as the November criminals, the people who had signed a treaty that had humiliated and crippled the nation. This created a profound crisis of legitimacy for the new republic from its very first day. The treaty also had a significant, and in many ways, paradoxical effect on the German military. The Freikorps and the old imperial army had been instrumental in crushing the communist uprisings, but the treaty now demanded that they be drastically reduced in size. The army, or Reichswehr, was to be limited to a mere 100,000 men. This was meant to be a way of disarming Germany and ensuring that it could never wage an aggressive war again. But it had the opposite effect. The new, smaller army was filled with officers from the old imperial army who were deeply conservative and had no loyalty to the new republic. They saw the army not as a tool of the state, but as a state within a state, a sacred institution that was loyal to itself and its traditions. They used the military restrictions as a way to weed out any liberal or democratic-leaning officers, creating an army that was a bastion of right-wing, anti-democratic sentiment. The military, which had been a pillar of the old empire, was now a constant threat to the new republic. The treaty's most controversial and damaging provision was the War Guilt Clause, Article 231, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the outbreak of the war. This was not just a legal and financial clause. It was a moral one. It was a humiliation that Germans of all political persuasions, from the left to the far right, found impossible to accept. It was a clear and powerful justification for the stab-in-the-back myth, which we have discussed before. The myth was now given an international stamp of approval. The men who had signed the treaty, the men of the Weimar Republic, were now seen as having officially betrayed the nation. Historians still argue whether the Treaty of Versailles was, in fact, a fatal blow to the Weimar Republic. Some argue that the Republic, even without the treaty, would have collapsed due to its deep internal divisions. Others argue that the treaty was a poison pill, a document so humiliating and so economically crippling that it made the survival of the new democracy impossible. A true historical fact is that the treaty became a constant political weapon in the hands of the Republic's enemies. The political debate in Germany for the next decade would not be about the economy or social policy, but about the humiliation of the treaty and the question of how to undo it. The treaty also had a profound effect on the international stage. It made it difficult for Germany to be a full and equal partner in the New World Order. It created an international pariah state, one that was always looking for a way to break free from the constraints of the treaty. This external pressure, combined with the internal instability of the revolution's legacy, created a perfect storm for the new republic. The revolution had created a new German state, but it had not given it the tools to survive in a world that was still punishing it for its past. The unresolved issues of the revolution, the political violence, the economic inequality, the deep-seated divisions, were now exacerbated by the harsh realities of the post-war world. The stage was now set for the final and most devastating act of the Weimar tragedy, a tragedy that was born in the streets of the German Revolution and would end in a far darker place. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles and the crushing financial burden of reparations gave birth to a powerful and destructive narrative that would haunt the Weimar Republic for its entire life. This was the stab-in-the-back myth, the Dolchstoßlegende, a lie so potent it became a central pillar of right-wing political rhetoric and the foundation for a profound sense of national betrayal. The myth, in its simplest form, claimed that Germany's military had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by treacherous civilians at home. This simple, elegant lie was a much-needed psychological balm for a defeated nation. It was easier to believe in a betrayal than to accept the bitter reality of a military defeat. The myth provided a ready-made scapegoat for the loss of the war and the humiliation of the peace treaty. The myth was a political creation, a deliberate and cynical act of historical revisionism. It was promoted by the very men who had led the military to its catastrophic defeat. General Erich Ludendorff and Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, the powerful duo who had been the de facto rulers of Germany during the final years of the war, were its most ardent champions. They found it far more convenient to shift the blame for their own strategic failures onto the new government and the revolutionaries who had brought down the Kaiser. The myth claimed that the German army, which was on the verge of victory, was stabbed in the back by the civilian population, particularly by socialists as pacifists and Jews who had organized strikes and undermined the war effort. The signing of the armistice was framed not as a necessary act to save the country from total collapse, but as a treacherous act by the November criminals. The consequences of this myth were devastating for the young republic. It completely undermined the legitimacy of the new democratic government from its very first day. The Weimar Republic was now seen by many Germans not as a legitimate successor to the empire, but as an illegitimate government born of a betrayal and dedicated to the destruction of the nation. It created a deep and lasting sense of national humiliation and resentment. This resentment was not a simple political disagreement. It was a profound psychological wound that made any kind of national unity impossible. The myth also gave rise to a deep and virulent strain of anti-Semitism. The portrayal of Jews as the primary conspirators in the national betrayal was a central and essential element of the narrative, a precursor to the horrific anti-Jewish policies that would follow. A true historical fact is that the myth was so pervasive that even many moderate middle-class Germans who had no love for the monarchy came to believe it. Historians still argue whether the stab-in-the-back myth was a uniquely German phenomenon or a predictable consequence of a nation losing a war. It was told it was winning. What is certain is that the myth was not just a historical lie. It was a political tool. It poisoned the well of German politics and made it impossible for the Republic to ever truly heal from the wounds of the war. It provided a powerful and simple explanation for all of Germany's ills: the economic crises, the political instability, the national humiliation. The myth was, in a sense, the revenge of the old imperial elite on the new democratic government. It was a lie that would one day pave the way for a man who would build an entire political movement on the foundation of that very same lie. The German Revolution had ended in a compromise, but the legacy of that compromise was not peace and stability. It was a profound and lasting sense of resentment and a powerful myth that would one day consume the very nation it was created to save. The revolution had created a new German state, but it had not healed the deep wounds of the war. Instead, it had left them festering, and the stab-in-the-back myth was the ideological infection that would one day turn that festering wound into a national gangrene. The stage was now set for the final and most devastating act of the Weimar tragedy. The political climate of the Weimar Republic, born out of the German Revolution, was one of constant and profound instability. The period from 1919 to the late 1920s was a political minefield, characterized by a series of crises that threatened to undo the new republic at every turn. The revolution had created a democratic system, but it had not created a democratic culture, and the country was still deeply divided. The political parties of the new republic were not just opponents, they were, in many cases, bitter enemies who saw each other as a fundamental threat to the nation. This made the business of governing almost impossible. The Weimar Republic was a parliamentary democracy, and the government was a coalition of political parties that had to constantly negotiate and compromise to get anything done. This was made even more difficult by the system of proportional representation enshrined in the new constitution. While fair, it led to a proliferation of small parties, making it nearly impossible for any single party to gain a majority. The result was a constant succession of fragile, short-lived coalition governments. It was a bit like trying to build a house with a different crew of builders every week. You might get a lot of ideas, but you'd be hard-pressed to finish the roof. This political instability was a source of constant frustration for the German people, who yearned for a strong and decisive government that could solve the nation's problems. The assassinations of prominent political figures, which we've mentioned before, were not just isolated acts of violence. They were a central part of the political landscape. The far right, fueled by the stab in the back myth, saw these murders as a way to punish the November criminals and to terrorize the new republic into submission. The government's failure to bring the perpetrators to justice, due to a judiciary that was still filled with anti-republican judges, only emboldened the assassins and deepened the sense of betrayal felt by the left. Political violence had become a normalized and accepted part of German public life, a direct and tragic legacy of the revolution's unresolved conflicts. The political climate was also a direct reflection of the deep-seated social divisions that the revolution had failed to resolve. The German working class, which had been the backbone of the revolution, felt that it had been betrayed by the Social Democrats, who they saw as having sold out their revolutionary ideals for a place in power. This left them open to the promises of the more radical Communist Party, KPD, which continued to agitate for a new revolution. The middle class, meanwhile, had been decimated by the economic crises of the early 1920s, particularly the hyperinflation of 1923. They had lost their savings and their sense of security, and they saw the new republic as a corrupt and incompetent failure. This economic desperation made them receptive to the anti-democratic rhetoric of the far right, which promised a return to order and a restoration of national honor. Historians still argue whether the Weimar Republic was doomed from the start. Was its failure an inevitable consequence of the deep-seated divisions and unresolved conflicts left over from the revolution? Or was it a series of unfortunate events and political miscalculations? A central historical fact is that the Weimar Republic was never able to create a sense of national unity. It was a nation of competing tribes, each with its own political party, its own paramilitary groups, and its own vision for the future. The old Imperial Germany, for all its flaws, had at least had a sense of national purpose and a clear set of values. The new Germany was a political free-for-all, a chaotic and unstable experiment in democracy that was constantly on the verge of collapse. The revolution, in a sense, had not created a new nation. It had simply exposed the profound and lasting cracks in the old one. The stage was now set for a new and more devastating kind of political warfare, a war that would be fought not just with words and bullets, but with the hopes and fears of an exhausted and disillusioned nation. The German Revolution of 1918 to 1919 created a new republic, but it failed to give that republic a shared sense of purpose or a clear path forward. Instead, it left a legacy of deep-seated and unresolved conflicts that would plague the Weimar Republic for its entire short life. This unfinished business, in a sense, was the true legacy of the revolution. The revolution had succeeded in overthrowing the old system, but it had failed to create a new one that was truly stable or unified. The result was a country that was constantly on the brink of collapse, a nation of competing factions and irreconcilable differences. One of the most profound of these unresolved issues was the relationship between the government and the military. The Ebert-Groener Pact, a pragmatic deal that had saved the government from the radical left, was a fatal compromise that left the old military elite in power. The Reichswehr, the new, smaller army, was a bastion of anti-democratic sentiment, filled with officers who had no loyalty to the Republic. The Kapp Putsch had shown that this military was willing to betray the government, but the government, in its weakness, was unwilling to dismantle it. This created a situation where the Republic was entirely dependent on a force that was actively hostile to its existence. This was, in a sense, the ultimate paradox of the revolution. It had won a political victory by relying on its own future executioners. Another key failure was the inability to enact fundamental social and economic reform. The revolution had been fueled by the suffering of the working class, but the new government, in its rush to compromise, had failed to deliver on the promises of land reform and the nationalization of industry. This left the old industrial and agricultural elites, the very people who had benefited from the old imperial system, in a position of continued power and influence. It also alienated the working class, who felt that their revolution had been betrayed. This created a deep and lasting divide between the working class and the new government, a divide that would make it impossible for them to unite against the rising tide of the far right. Historians still argue whether the SPD could have pushed for more radical change without risking a bloody civil war, but a true historical fact is that their cautious approach left the country with a profound sense of unresolved class conflict. The revolution also failed to create a new political culture. The old imperial Germany had a culture of obedience and deference to authority. The new Weimar Republic was a chaotic and unstable democracy with a multitude of political parties, each with its own armed paramilitary wing. The revolution had introduced political violence into the mainstream, and the government, by using the Freikorps to crush the left, had legitimized that violence. The constant assassinations, the street battles between rival gangs, and the political coups were not just signs of instability. They were a symptom of a new, deeply sick political culture. The revolution had torn down the old system, but it had not built a new one that was strong enough to resist the forces of extremism. The long shadow of the German Revolution, therefore, was one of unresolved conflict and deep-seated bitterness. The revolution had created a new German state, but it had not created a new German people. The old hatreds and divisions were still there, festering just beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to erupt again. The stage was now set for the final act of the Weimar tragedy, a tragedy that would be defined by the failures and compromises of the revolution that had given it life. The revolution was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new and even more dangerous chapter. The German Revolution of 1918-19 was, in a sense, an unfinished revolution. It had toppled an empire and created a new republic, but it had failed to address the deep-seated social and economic inequalities that had fueled the unrest in the first place. The new Weimar Republic, for all its democratic promises, was still a nation of haves and have-nots, and the revolution's failure to fundamentally transform German society left a legacy of resentment and bitterness that would plague the country for years. This unfinished business was not a minor detail. It was a profound and lasting source of instability. One of the most significant pieces of unfinished business was the Treaty of Versailles. We have talked about its role in giving rise to the stab-in-the-back myth, but its effects went far beyond political rhetoric. The treaty's economic terms, particularly the staggering reparations payments, were a constant source of hardship and humiliation for the German people. The new republic, in a sense, was born with a crushing debt that it could never hope to repay. This created a political environment where the focus was not on building a new Germany, but on finding a way to get out from under the burden of the treaty. The government was constantly in a state of crisis, trying to negotiate new payment plans and deal with the economic consequences of a ruined economy. This created a sense of national despair and a feeling that the new republic was incapable of solving the nation's problems. Another key failure was the lack of a true military reform. The army, the Reichswehr, which had been so instrumental in crushing the left, was allowed to remain a state within a state, loyal to its own traditions and its own anti-democratic leaders. The Kapp Putsch had shown that this military was willing to betray the Republic, but the government, in its weakness, was unable to dismantle it. This left the new Republic with a profound vulnerability. It was a democracy without a democratic army, and it was a republic that was entirely dependent on a force that was actively hostile to its existence. This was not just an institutional failure, it was a moral one. It meant that the old imperial elite, the very people who had led the country to war and defeat, were still a powerful force in the new Germany, waiting for their chance to strike. A true historical fact of the Weimar Republic is that no chancellor was ever able to fully command the loyalty of the army, a fundamental weakness that would have devastating consequences. The revolution also failed to create a new, unified political culture. The old imperial Germany had been a country of classes, but the new Germany was a nation of competing factions. The revolution had created a deep and lasting divide between the left and the right, a divide that was often more a matter of hatred than of political difference. The Communist Party, KPD, and the Social Democrats, SPD, the two largest parties on the left, refused to work together, seeing each other as a greater enemy than the rising tide of the far right. This was a fatal division, a little like two people in a sinking boat arguing over whose fault it is while the water rises around their ankles. This political tribalism was a direct legacy of the revolution's unresolved conflicts and its brutal violence. Historians still argue whether the German Revolution's unfinished business made the rise of Nazism inevitable. Was the Weimar Republic doomed from the start, or could it have survived if it had been given a chance? We will never know. What we do know is that the revolution left behind a nation that was traumatized, divided, and deeply disillusioned. It had created a political system that was too weak to solve the nation's problems, and a political culture that was too divided to ever truly heal. The revolution, in a sense, had not created a new Germany. It had simply exposed the profound and lasting cracks in the old one. The stage was now set for the final and most devastating act of the Weimar tragedy. The German Revolution's long shadow fell heavily on the new Weimar Republic, and it was a shadow defined by bitterness and a deep sense of unresolved national trauma. While the political and social conflicts of the revolution were primarily internal, the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919 was an external event that sealed the Republic's fate. It was a humiliating and punitive peace, a stark contrast to the moderate revolution that had preceded it. The treaty, with its draconian terms and the infamous war guilt clause, became a powerful tool for the Republic's enemies on the far right. They could now argue, with a certain level of emotional resonance, that the new Republic was a foreign imposition, a government of traitors who had sold out the nation to its enemies. The treaty also created a fundamental paradox for the Weimar Republic. The revolution had been about creating a new, more just Germany, but the treaty forced the new republic to be a nation of a defeated and humiliated people. This created a profound sense of national despair and a deep-seated feeling that the sacrifices of the war had been for nothing. The German people had gone to war as a great imperial power, and they had emerged from the revolution as a defeated, disarmed, and economically crippled state. The men who had signed the treaty, the very men who had brought about the new republic, were now seen as the architects of the nation's humiliation. The treaty was a constant source of political tension. The question of how to deal with the reparations and the military restrictions dominated the political discourse for years. It made it almost impossible for the government to focus on the much-needed internal reforms. The political parties were not just arguing over social policy. They were fighting over the very soul of the nation. The right-wing parties, fueled by the stab-in-the-back myth, constantly attacked the government for its weakness and its willingness to accept the terms of the treaty. The left-wing parties, meanwhile, were too busy fighting among themselves to form a united front against the forces of reaction. The revolution had created a new German state, but it had not created a new German people, and the old nationalistic hatreds, now exacerbated by the humiliation of the treaty, were still very much alive. A central historical fact of this period is that the Treaty of Versailles, by forcing the new republic to accept sole responsibility for the war created a profound and lasting sense of injustice that was felt across all political divides. It was not just the nationalists who resented the treaty. Even many socialists and liberals believed it was an unfair and punitive peace. This lack of a shared national vision or a sense of national pride left a vacuum that would later be filled by a new and more dangerous kind of nationalism, one that promised to restore Germany to its former glory. The revolution had failed to create a national narrative that could unite the German people, and the treaty had ensured that the only narrative that would resonate was one of national humiliation and betrayal. Historians still argue whether the Treaty of Versailles was a fatal blow to the Weimar Republic. Some argue that the treaty's economic and political effects were so severe that the Republic was doomed from the start. Others argue that the treaty was not as crippling as the Germans claimed, and that the Republic could have survived if it had been able to overcome its deep internal divisions. What is certain is that the treaty was a poison pill, a document that poisoned the political atmosphere and gave the Republic's enemies a powerful and enduring weapon. The revolution had created a fragile new democracy, and the treaty had ensured that it would be a democracy under siege from its very first day. The stage was now set for the final act of the Weimar tragedy, a tragedy that would be born out of the failures and compromises of the German Revolution and sealed by the harsh realities of the post-war world. The political climate of the Weimar Republic, born out of the chaos of the German Revolution, was defined by a constant state of crisis. The assassinations of political leaders, the constant shifting of fragile coalition governments, and the perpetual threat from both the far left and the far right created an environment of profound instability. This was not a healthy democracy. It was a country on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The deep-seated divisions that had fueled the revolution were now baked into the political system, and they would poison the well of German public life for years to come. The political system itself was in many ways an extension of the revolution's failures. The system of proportional representation, while fair, made it nearly impossible to form a stable majority. This led to a constant succession of short-lived coalition governments that were too weak and too busy fighting among themselves to enact the long-term reforms that the country so desperately needed. It was a democracy in a perpetual state of gridlock. This political paralysis was a source of immense frustration for the German people, who yearned for a strong and decisive government that could solve the nation's problems. The constant political turmoil was exacerbated by a series of economic crises. The hyperinflation of 1923, which saw the value of the German mark plummet to absurd levels, was a profound psychological blow. It wiped out the savings of the middle class and left millions of people in a state of utter desperation. This economic collapse was a powerful tool for the Republic's enemies, who could now argue that the democratic system was a failure. The left-wing parties, meanwhile, were too busy fighting among themselves to form a united front against the forces of reaction. This was a fatal division, a direct legacy of the revolution's unresolved conflicts. The Communist Party, KPD, and the Social Democrats, SPD, the two largest parties on the left, refused to work together, seeing each other as a greater enemy than the rising tide of the far right. This political tribalism was a direct and tragic legacy of the revolution's brutal violence and its failed compromises. A mainstream historical fact is that the failure of the German left to unite against the rising tide of Nazism was a direct consequence of the deep-seated mistrust and bitterness that was born out of the German Revolution. Historians still argue whether the Weimar Republic was doomed from the start. Was its failure an inevitable consequence of the deep-seated divisions and unresolved conflicts left over from the Revolution? Or was it a series of unfortunate events and political miscalculations? We will never know. What we do know is that the Revolution left behind a nation that was traumatized, divided, and deeply disillusioned. It had created a political system that was too weak to solve the nation's problems, and political culture that was too divided to ever truly heal. The revolution, in a sense, had not created a new Germany. It had simply exposed the profound and lasting cracks in the old one. The stage was now set for the final and most devastating act of the Weimar tragedy. The German Revolution of 1918 to 1919 was, in a sense, a story of two different futures battling for the soul of the nation. On one side was the vision of a radical, socialist Germany, where power would be in the hands of the workers and a new, more just society would be built from the ground up. On the other side was the vision of a moderate, parliamentary democracy, where the old power structures would be reformed, not destroyed, and where stability would be prized above all else. The moderate vision, led by the Social Democrats, won the day, but it did so in a way that left a legacy of profound bitterness and division. The long shadow of the revolution, therefore, was not a single event, but a series of interconnected failures that would plague the new Weimar Republic. One of the most significant of these was the failure to reform the military. The Ebert-Groener Pact, a pragmatic deal that had saved the government from the radical left, was a fatal compromise that left the old military elite in power. The Reichswehr, the new, smaller army, was a bastion of anti-democratic sentiment, filled with officers who had no loyalty to the Republic. The Kapp Putsch had shown that this military was willing to betray the government, but the government, in its weakness, was unable to dismantle it. This created a situation where the Republic was entirely dependent on a force that was actively hostile to its existence. This was, in a sense, the ultimate paradox of the revolution. It had won a political victory by relying on its own future executioners. Another key failure was the inability to enact fundamental social and economic reform. The revolution had been fueled by the suffering of the working class, but the new government, in its rush to compromise, had failed to deliver on the promises of land reform and the nationalization of industry. This left the old industrial and agricultural elites, the very people who had benefited from the old imperial system, in a position of continued power and influence. It also alienated the working class, who felt that their revolution had been betrayed. This created a deep and lasting divide between the working class and the new government, a divide that would make it impossible for them to unite against the rising tide of the far right. Historians still argue whether the SPD could have pushed for more radical change without risking a bloody civil war, but an open scholarly debate is whether this cautious approach was a necessary evil or a fatal mistake. The revolution also failed to create a new political culture. The old imperial Germany had a culture of obedience and deference to authority. The new Weimar Republic was a chaotic and unstable democracy with a multitude of political parties, each with its own armed paramilitary wing. The revolution had introduced political violence into the mainstream, and the government, by using the Freikorps to crush the left, had legitimized that violence. The constant assassinations, the street battles between rival gangs, and the political coups were not just signs of instability. They were a symptom of a new, deeply sick political culture. The revolution had torn down the old system, but it had not built a new one that was strong enough to resist the forces of extremism. The long shadow of the German Revolution, therefore, was one of unresolved conflict and deep-seated bitterness. The revolution had created a new German state, but it had not created a new German people. The old hatreds and divisions were still there, festering just beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to erupt again. The revolution was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new and even more dangerous chapter. The failures and compromises of the German Revolution created the fertile ground in which later extremists and anti-democratic forces would flourish. The stage was now set for the final and most devastating act of the Weimar tragedy. The German Revolution of 1918 to 1919 was, in a sense, a chaotic opening act for the Weimar Republic. It was a period of immense change that brought about a democratic government, but left behind a legacy of profound instability. The revolution, in its failure to fully address the deep-seated issues that had fueled it, created a fertile ground for later extremists and anti-democratic forces to flourish. This was not a story of a single, tragic failure, but a complex interplay of unresolved conflicts, bitterness, and political miscalculation. The most significant and long-lasting legacy of the revolution was the deep and permanent political polarization of the German left. The brutal suppression of the Spartacist and Bavarian uprisings and the murders of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht created a profound and lasting rift between the Communist Party, KPD, and the Social Democrats, SPD. The KPD, convinced that the SPD had betrayed the revolution, refused to work with them, and instead pursued a policy of constantly undermining the new republic. The SPD, in turn, saw the communists as an existential threat, a force that was trying to bring about a violent, Soviet-style civil war. This division was a fatal flaw in the Weimar Republic's political life. The two largest parties on the left, the very parties that should have been able to form a united front against the rising tide of the far right, were bitter enemies. This left a vacuum in the political center that would one day be filled by the radical promises of the far right. Another key legacy was the normalization of political violence. The revolution had been a chaotic and often bloody affair, and the government, in its desperation to restore order, had used the Freikorps to brutally suppress the left. This legitimized political violence as a means to an end. The constant assassinations of political leaders, the street battles between rival gangs, and the political coups were not just signs of instability. They were a symptom of a new, deeply sick political culture. The revolution had torn down the old system, but it had not built a new one that was strong enough to resist the forces of extremism. The Weimar Republic, in a sense, never had a chance to develop a peaceful and stable political culture. It was born in violence and lived its entire life under the shadow of violence. A historical fact of this era is that there were over 300 political assassinations in the Weimar Republic's first 5 years, a clear testament to the political violence that the revolution had unleashed. Finally, the revolution left behind a profound and lasting sense of national humiliation and betrayal. The stab in the back myth, which we have discussed before, became a central pillar of right-wing political rhetoric. It was a lie that provided a powerful and comforting explanation for Germany's defeat in the war and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. This myth poisoned the political atmosphere and made it impossible for the new republic to ever gain a sense of true legitimacy. The revolution's leaders, the men who had signed the armistice and the treaty, were now seen as traitors to the nation. This created a profound sense of resentment and a powerful narrative that would one day be used to justify the destruction of the very republic they had helped to create. The failures and compromises of the German Revolution created the fertile ground in which later extremists and anti-democratic forces would flourish. Historians still argue whether the German Revolution's legacy was one of success or failure. Was it a pragmatic compromise that saved Germany from a bloody civil war, or was it a fatal mistake that laid the groundwork for the rout of Nazism? We will never know. What we do know is that the revolution left behind a nation that was traumatized, divided, and deeply disillusioned. The revolution was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new and even more dangerous chapter. The long shadow of the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919 fell across the entire lifespan of the Weimar Republic, shaping its politics, its economy, and its culture. The failures and compromises of those chaotic months created the fertile ground in which later extremists and anti-democratic forces would flourish. The revolution was not the end of the story. It was the prologue to a new and even more dangerous chapter in German history, a chapter that would be defined by the unresolved conflicts and simmering resentments that the revolution had left behind. The revolution's most significant and lasting legacy was the profound and permanent political polarization of the German left. The brutal suppression of the Spartacist and Bavarian uprisings and the murders of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht created a deep and lasting rift between the Communist Party, KPD, and the Social Democrats, SPD. The KPD, convinced that the SPD had betrayed the revolution, refused to work with them, and instead pursued a policy of constantly undermining the new republic. The SPD, in turn, saw the communists as an existential threat, a force that was trying to bring about a violent, Soviet-style civil war. This division was a fatal flaw in the Weimar Republic's political life. The two largest parties on the left, the very parties that should have been able to form a united front against the rising tide of the far right, were bitter enemies. This left a vacuum in the political center that would one day be filled by the radical promises of the far right. Another key legacy was the normalization of political violence. The revolution had been a chaotic and often bloody affair, and the government, in its desperation to restore order, had used the Freikorps to brutally suppress the left. This legitimized political violence as a means to an end. The constant assassinations of political leaders, the street battles between rival gangs, and the political coups were not just signs of instability. They were a symptom of a new, deeply sick political culture. The revolution had torn down the old system, but it had not built a new one that was strong enough to resist the forces of extremism. The Weimar Republic, in a sense, never had a chance to develop a peaceful and stable political culture. It was born in violence and lived its entire life under the shadow of violence. Historians still argue whether this political violence was an inevitable consequence of the social and political turmoil of the time or a unique and dangerous phenomenon. What is certain is that the failures and compromises of the German Revolution created the fertile ground in which later extremists and anti-democratic forces would flourish. Finally, the revolution left behind a profound and lasting sense of national humiliation and betrayal. The stab in the back myth, which we have discussed before, became a central pillar of right-wing political rhetoric. It was a lie that provided a powerful and comforting explanation for Germany's defeat in the war and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. This myth poisoned the political atmosphere and made it impossible for the new republic to ever gain a sense of true legitimacy. The revolution's leaders, the men who had signed the armistice and the treaty, were now seen as traitors to the nation. This created a profound sense of resentment and a powerful narrative that would one day be used to justify the destruction of the very republic they had helped to create. The failures and compromises of the German Revolution created the fertile ground in which later extremists and anti-democratic forces would flourish. The revolution, in a sense, never ended. It simply morphed into a new, more dangerous kind of political warfare. The unresolved conflicts of 1918 to 1919, the lack of military reform, the failure of social and economic change, the deep political divisions, festered beneath the surface of the Weimar Republic. They created a political landscape that was weak, divided, and ready to be exploited. The revolution had exposed the deep and lasting cracks in the old Germany, and in its failure to heal them, it set the stage for a new and far greater tragedy. And so, the grand story of the German Revolution, with all its sound and fury, gently winds down. We began on the cold, foggy decks of warships in Wilhelm's haven, a place of quiet, simmering defiance, and we have traced the long and winding path to the halls of a fragile republic. The shouts of the revolutionaries, the impassioned speeches of the leaders, the distant echoes of gunfire in the streets, all of it now fades into a gentle hum. The tension that once crackled in the air of Berlin and Munich has long since dissipated, dissolving like mist over the city canals. The great figures of this story, Ebert, Scheidemann, Luxemburg, Liebknecht, have all taken their place in the annals of history, their struggles and their sacrifices now just a part of a larger, unfolding dream. The old Germany, with its kings and empires, has sunk into legend, and the new one, born of a whisper and a scream, has become a story of its own. Its triumphs and its tragedies are now just whispers in the wind, a quiet reminder of a time when the world was remade in a flash. And so, the story ends, not with a bang, but with a peaceful silence, a quiet settling of the dust of history. The journey is over, and it's time to rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.